will hear heavy rain at the beginning, making it seem like the sky is crying. The storm will calm down as the stories start. It may be hard to get through, but your support means a lot to us. Real-life overwhelm is often hard to process because it feels chaotic and direct. Stories provide psychological distance. When you experience fear, sadness, or triumph through a character, you are able to feel those intense emotions in a completely safe, controlled environment. It allows you to release pent-up emotional tension without the real-world consequences. When time stresses, stories heal. Welcome back to True Horror Stories Film. I'm Alex. I find the night is the only time we can truly face our unsettling truths. But it's also the time we need comfort the most. If your mind is racing and the dark feels heavy, consider me your faithful companion. Tonight is a completely unbroken sanctuary to make sure your rest stays deeply peaceful. If this space brings you comfort, please subscribe and leave a like. Tell me where you are listening from and what is keeping you up. You are incredibly safe here. What she left inside. There is a homestead at the end of a long metal track in the Ida Valley of central Otago, New Zealand, where the tussock runs gold in every season, and the air is so dry it preserves things that were never meant to last. Old timber, old fabric, old grief. Rowena Marsh drove down from Auckland to sell it. She had not earned it, she knew that, and she did not want it in the way a person wants something they understand. She wanted to price it, list it, and leave. She had done this with dozens of properties in 20 years of development work, and she was very good at it, and she told herself this one would be no different. She was wrong before she reached the front door, because in the wool room at the end of the ground floor hallway, lit by a single bulb on a pull cord, on a sewing table her grandmother had used every day of her adult life, there was a child's dress in progress. Half-made, needle still threaded, pin still in the fabric, waiting, and the dress was sized for a child, and Rowena had no children. And the valley, in the dark that came suddenly and completely once the light left it, had begun to make sounds she could not immediately explain. This is the story of what Rowena found inside Callaway Station. It is a story about the things we are told, and the things that are kept from us, about love that works in secret, in a room at the end of a hallway in the dark, for years, because the door has been closed by someone with the authority to close it, about what happens when a woman arrives at a place that has been waiting for her, not with malice, not with hunger, but with the specific, patient tenderness of something that has had a very long time to prepare what it wants to give her. Settle in. The valley is cold tonight. The stars over the Old Man Range are numerous enough to feel structural. And in the wool room, the needle is still threaded. I need to say the shameful thing first, before I tell you what I found in the wool room of my grandmother's station homestead, because the shameful thing is the reason I went there, and because the things that happened to me in that valley only make sense if you understand the person I was when I arrived. I went to Ida Valley to sell the property, not to grieve, not to sort through 80 years of a woman's life with the care that 80 years deserves. I went because my grandmother, Maud Callaway, died in April at the age of 83 and left the Callaway Station homestead to me alone. Not to my mother, not to my Aunt Philippa, not to any of the cousins who had actually spent summers there as children and who had actual memories of the place. But to me, her eldest grandchild, the one who had visited exactly twice in 30 years, and who lived in Auckland and worked in property development, and who was, by any honest accounting, the least qualified person in the family to be trusted with something that old and that specific. My name is Rowena Marsh. I am 44 years old. I am, or was, a person who understood land primarily as an asset class, and I had been in the Ida Valley for approximately 3 hours before the valley began to correct this understanding. in ways I had not invited and could not subsequently undo. The drive south from Christchurch takes the better part of a day if you go through Omara, MA, and over the Lindis Pass, which I did because the solicitor in Alexandra had described this as the most direct route, and because I had not grown up in the South Island and did not know the roads well enough to deviate from. Direct. The Lindis Pass in late April is a thing I was not prepared for. The tussock on the pass slopes was the color of old bone, bleached pale by the summer just finished, and the wind that came across it had a specific quality I had not encountered before. Not cold exactly, not yet, but declarative. The wind of a landscape that has decided to be honest with you before you have a chance to form expectations. The sky above the pass was the blue of deep water, the specific saturated blue of a sky that has no humidity in it and therefore no softness, a sky that is entirely itself without apology. I came down off the Lindis and into the Ida Valley in the early afternoon, and the valley opened around me in the way that basin country opens, all at once. The ranges on both sides, materializing from what had seemed like a single continuous slope, the valley floor spreading flat and tawny between them, the schist tors on the Old Man Range to the south, standing in their irregular formations against the sky like something structural, like something the sky required in order to maintain its shape. I had the solicitor's directions on the seat beside me, handwritten on the back of a business card in the small, deliberate script of a man who learned penmanship before word processors made it optional. The station Homestead was 14 kilometers off the valley road on a metal track that the solicitor had described as manageable in a standard vehicle, by which he had meant, I understood when I reached it, manageable in the sense that I would arrive, rather than the sense that the journey would be comfortable. The homestead appeared at the end of the track in the manner of central Otago buildings of its era, without announcement, as if it had simply grown from the schist tussock the way geological features grow slowly and without reference to anyone's expectations. It was a 2-story stone structure, with a corrugated iron roof that had rusted to the amber brown of the surrounding tussock, almost camouflaged by it, as if the building had been there long enough to begin the process of becoming the landscape rather than merely occupying it. A veranda ran the length of the front face. The windows were intact. The door was locked with a key the solicitor had given me in Alexandra. A heavy iron key of the kind that belongs to a lock that was installed when the key itself was the only security available and was therefore made to last. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I am a person who has spent 20 years being dishonest about what I feel in favor of what is efficient, and the story I am trying to tell requires precision. What I felt was not grief. What I felt was the specific discomfort of a person who has arrived somewhere they have not earned the right to be. My grandmother had left this property to me, and I did not know why, and I was planning to sell it. And the not knowing why had been bothering me since the solicitor read the will in his Alexandra office, with the Old Man Range visible through the window behind him, and Aunt Philippa sitting beside me, saying nothing in the particular way she says nothing when she has a great deal to say, and has decided this is not the moment. The air outside the car was extraordinary. I am not a person who uses that word carelessly, but I have no other word for air that is that dry and that cold and that clean simultaneously. Air that arrives in the lungs with the quality of something that has been nowhere near a city in a very long time, and has therefore retained properties that city air surrenders. The valley smelled of tussock and schist, and the particular mineral dryness of soil that receives very little rain, and retains almost none of what it does receive. It smelled faintly and specifically of lanolin, the residue of decades of sheep, the smell of a working station that had been a working station since 1893, and that held this smell in its timbers and its stone. The way old buildings hold the smell of what they have always been. I let myself in through the front door. The interior was dim, the afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows at the low angle of an autumn sun in the 45th parallel, illuminating dust motes in the entry hall with the particular golden specificity of light that has traveled a long distance at a low angle and is doing its most beautiful work in the last hour before it gives up for the day. The furniture was still in the rooms. My grandmother had not, apparently, anticipated needing to clear the property before she died, which meant either that she had not expected to die when she did, or that she had expected it and had decided this was something for someone else to manage. Given what I came to understand about Maud Calloway over the following days, the second seemed more probable. I moved through the house the way I move through properties I am assessing, methodically, room by room, noting condition and dimensions and the particular character of light in each space. The kitchen still held the smell of wood ash from the range. The sitting room had a window seat that faced north across the tussock toward the Hawkdun range, and someone had left a cup on the window seat's ledge. Not recently. The cup had been there long enough to leave a ring mark on the timber, but not so long that the cup itself had gathered more than a thin layer of the valley's dry dust. I stood in the sitting room and looked at the cup, and wondered who had last sat in that window seat drinking from it, and whether they had been watching the Hawkduns or something closer. And this was the first time in the 3 hours since I arrived in the valley that the question of my grandmother felt personal rather than procedural. There were 6 bedrooms on the upper floor. One of them, the largest, facing east, had been my grandmother's. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, folded beside a glass of water that had evaporated completely, leaving only the faint mineral residue of its own absence on the inside of the glass. I stood in the doorway of this room for a long time without going in, which I told myself was out of respect for her privacy, and which was, more honestly, something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something that requires more from you than you have yet decided to give. I went back downstairs. At the end of the ground floor hallway, past the kitchen and the cold store and a room the solicitor's notes identified as the original station office, was a door I had not noticed on my first pass through the house. It was narrower than the other doors, set into the stone wall at an angle that suggested it had been retrofitted rather than original to the building's construction. The frame was timber where the surrounding wall was schist, and the door itself was heavy pine planking with an iron latch rather than a knob, the kind of door that is built for function rather than appearance, built by someone who needed access to a specific room, and built the door to provide it without ceremony. The latch was stiff. I worked it twice before it gave. The smell that came out stopped me in the doorway. It was wool. The deep, animal-warm smell of raw wool, not lanolin exactly, not the outdoor smell of the fleece still on the animal, but the indoor smell of wool that has been washed and dried and stored in a dry space for a long time. The smell of fiber that has been handled and worked and kept carefully. It was not unpleasant. It was, in a way that I cannot make entirely rational, the smell of something that had been waiting in the dark to be recognized. I found the light switch. A single bulb on a pull cord illuminated a room approximately 4 meters by 5, with stone walls and a timber floor, and along the left-hand wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving that held labeled boxes in the neat, compulsive order of someone who spent a great deal of time in this room and required it to be organized. Along the right-hand wall, beneath the room's single small window, north-facing, the Hawkduns visible through it in the last of the afternoon light, was a sewing table, and on the sewing table, positioned as if its user had simply stepped away for a moment and would be back to resume, there was a garment in progress, needles still threaded, pins are still in the fabric, a length of merino wool in a particular color, deep gold. The exact color of the tussock in autumn, the color the valley wore on the afternoon I arrived, pinned into the shape of a child's dress, half-constructed, waiting. I stood in the doorway of the wool room and looked at the half-made dress and understood, with the specific certainty of a thing the body knows before the mind catches up, that I had just arrived somewhere I had been expected. The light through the north window was going fast, the hawk duns already losing their definition against the dimming sky, and the valley below the homestead was filling with the particular darkness of basin country after sunset. Not the gradual dark of hills, but the sudden dark of a flat space that the light simply abandons, all at once, without ceremony. The night in the Ida Valley was unlike any night I had experienced in a city, which is the only kind of night I had experienced in 20 years. It was not merely dark. It was the specific, total dark of a basin surrounded by ranges, a dark that arrived with the completeness of a decision rather than the gradualness of a transition, and once it arrived it occupied the space between the stars and the tussock floor, with a density that made the homestead's interior light feel less like illumination and more like a small argument the building was making against the surrounding dark. I had found candles in the kitchen cupboard. The generator, which the solicitor had mentioned in his handwritten notes, was housed in a lean-to beside the wool shed, and I had located it in the last of the afternoon light, but I had not been able to start it, because I am a person who grew up in suburbs and was educated in cities, and whose practical knowledge of mechanical things begins and ends with the kind that have user manuals available for download. I burned 3 candles in the kitchen while I ate the food I had brought from Alexandra. A meat pie from the bakery on Centennial Avenue, still faintly warm when I unpacked it. A container of coleslaw I had bought without wanting it because the woman at the counter had suggested it, and I had said yes the way I say yes to things when my mind is occupied with something else. My mind was occupied with the wool room. I had not gone back into it after finding the dress. This requires explanation, because I am not, by professional disposition or personal history, a person who avoids things. I have entered derelict buildings in poor condition to assess their structural viability. I have had difficult conversations in boardrooms with men who did not want to have them. Avoidance has not been, until the Ida Valley, a characteristic I would have claimed as mine. What I felt in the doorway of the wool room was not fear in the way fear usually announces itself, not the adrenaline signal, not the physical urgency of a threat. It was something quieter and more destabilizing, the feeling of standing at the precise boundary of something that will change the shape of your understanding once you cross it, and knowing, with a certainty that had no rational basis, that crossing it required more of you than you were carrying at that particular moment. So I had made tea instead, and eaten the pie, and sat in the kitchen with the candles, and the smell of wood ash from the cold range and the dark pressing against the windows. And I had thought about the dress. A child's dress, deep gold merino, the color of the valley, half-made, needle-threaded, pins in the fabric. My grandmother had been 83 years old and had no great-grandchildren and, as far as the family was aware, had not sewn anything for anyone in many years, her hands having developed the joint stiffness of very old age that makes fine work painful. And yet the dress was not old. The thread on the needle was not brittle. The fabric had not faded or gathered the particular yellowish quality of merino left too long in airless storage. The work in progress was recent enough that whoever had been doing it had expected to return. I pulled the solicitor's notes toward me across the kitchen table. He had given me a 2-page inventory of the property's contents, prepared by a local woman named Bev Tanner, who had acted as a sort of caretaker for the homestead since my grandmother moved to the residential home in Ranfurly, 2 years before her death. The inventory listed furniture, appliances, tools in the wool shed, a small collection of books in the sitting room, and the contents of the wool room, which were described in 3 terse lines. Shelving and storage boxes containing wool and fabric. 1 sewing table with associated equipment. Personal effects belonging to M. Calloway. Personal effects. The inventory did not describe the dress. I turned the page over, looking for annotation, and found none. The inventory had been completed 14 months ago, which meant the dress in its current state of half-completion had either been there for 14 months, and the caretaker had not noted it, or it had been created after the inventory was taken. In the 2-year period when my grandmother was in the home in Ranfurly, and the homestead was, according to the solicitor, unoccupied. I blew out 2 of the 3 candles before I went upstairs to sleep, because the candles were the homestead's candles and not mine to waste, which is a thought that surprised me with its specificity, given that I was planning to sell the property and everything in it. I slept in the 2nd bedroom, not my grandmother's. The bed was narrow and covered with a merino blanket in a pattern of dark green and cream that had the weight and density of something made to withstand genuine cold. And genuine cold was what the valley delivered through the night with the steady, patient commitment of a climate that has been cold in April for a very long time, and sees no reason to moderate itself for a visitor from Auckland. I lay under the blanket and listened to the valley's night sounds, which were different from any sounds I had catalogued before. There was no wind. The wind, which had been present all afternoon, had stopped at almost the same moment the light left, as if the 2 were connected, as if the valley held its breath at night, the way sleeping things hold their breath, the respiration slowed to something almost imperceptible, the air above the tussock so still that the cold settled into it in layers, the coldest air sinking to the basin floor, the frost forming without any disturbance to carry it sideways. Into this stillness at some point past midnight came a sound from below, not a creak, not the contraction of old timber in cold air, which is a sound I know from heritage buildings I have assessed, and which has a specific irregular rhythm, the rhythm of thermal response rather than intention. This was rhythmic, periodic, spaced with the evenness of something that was counting its own intervals, a soft, repeated sound from the direction of the ground floor, from the end of the hallway where the narrow door opened onto the wool room. I lay still and counted the repetitions. They came in groups of 3, with a pause between each group, consistent enough to be mechanical, soft enough that I could not be certain, from the loft of the 2nd bedroom, whether I was hearing something real or whether the silence of the valley had created a condition in which the sounds my own body made, my heartbeat, the movement of breath in my lungs, were audible in a way that city noise normally prevents. I counted 6 groups of 3 before the sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I noticed that my jaw ached. I had been clenching my back teeth without awareness, the specific tension of a person attending to something carefully in the dark. And when I released the clench, the relief of it was physical and immediate. I did not go downstairs. This is the 2nd thing I need to be honest about. I did not go downstairs, and I did not go downstairs because the part of me that was paying attention to the sound had already connected it to the wool room and the wool room's half-made dress, and the needle still threaded, and I was not yet ready to stand in that doorway again at past midnight in a valley I did not know. In a homestead that had belonged to a woman I had visited exactly twice and had understood, I was beginning to realize not at all. I lay under the merino blanket and thought about the last time I had seen my grandmother. It was 3 years ago in Ranfurly, at the residential home where she had moved after the station became too much for one person to manage. I had gone because my mother had asked me to go, and I had gone with the efficient goodwill of a person who considers an obligation fulfilled once the physical requirement of it has been met. Maud had been sitting in the common room in a chair beside the window, and she had looked at me when I came in with an expression I had not been able to read at the time and had not thought about since. Not surprise, not pleasure exactly, but something assessing and patient, the expression of a person who has been waiting to see how a particular thing turns out and is receiving preliminary data. She had asked me about my work. I had told her about the development in Takapuna. She had listened in the same assessing way, and then she had said, in the conversational tone of someone raising a topic they have been considering for some time, "Do you ever make anything, Rowena?" With your hands, I had said no. I had said my work was more conceptual. She had said yes. She had said it without judgment, with the specific neutrality of a word used to receive information rather than evaluate it. Then she had asked if I wanted tea, and I had said yes, and we had drunk tea by the window looking out at the Manio Toto, plain in the flat winter light, and that had been the last time. I had not thought about that conversation since the day it happened. I thought about it now, in the dark of the valley, with the merino blanket pulled to my chin, and the silence pressing against the windows in the wool room somewhere below me, and the sound from it, whatever it had been, now absent. Do you ever make anything with your hands? The morning arrived with the gradual tentative quality of a South Island high country morning in autumn. Not the assertive sunrise of the north, but a slow brightening that moved across the Hawkdun Range from east to west, the peaks catching the first light while the valley floor remained in the blue shadow of the ranges, reluctant and cold, the frost on the tussock rendering the flat ground between the homestead and the nearest fence line a specific temporary silver that would be gone within an hour of full sunrise. I was already downstairs when the light came. I had made tea on the gas hob. There were gas canisters beside the range, and I was standing at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands when I became aware that I had been standing there for some time, looking not at the valley, but at the reflection in the window glass, which showed the kitchen behind me, and, at the edge of the reflection's reach, the hallway that led to the wool room's door. The door was open. I had left it latched. I was certain of this in the way I am certain of the things I do last before leaving a space. It is a professional habit, checking the state of a space as I exit, noting condition, position, status. The latch had been stiff. I had worked it twice before it gave, and I had felt it settle back into the frame when I pulled the door shut behind me. The door was open now by perhaps 30 centimeters, not fully open. Ajar in the specific way of a door that has been opened by someone who did not want to make too much noise doing it. I turned from the window. I walked down the hallway. I stood in the opening and looked into the wool room in the thin, pre-full sunrise light that came through the north window, and I looked at the sewing table. The dress was further along, not finished, still pinned, still with the needle threaded, still a work in progress. But the seam along the left side had been sewn. I could see the line of it, even and tight, the stitching of someone who had been doing this work for decades, whose hands knew the intervals between stitches and the way a musician's hands know intervals between notes. The seam had not been there the afternoon before. I had looked at the dress for long enough to be certain of what it had contained, and the seam along the left side had not been among it. I stood in the doorway with my tea going cold in my hands, and I thought about the sound in the night. Periodic, rhythmic, grouped in threes, and I understood, with the land surveyor's precision, that is apparently a trait shared across certain kinds of minds regardless of profession, that what I had been hearing was the foot pedal of a treadle sewing machine being operated in the dark, and I understood, a moment after this, that there was no treadle sewing machine in the wool room. There was only the sewing table, and the dress, and the shelving, and the boxes labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, and the north window through which the Hawkduns were visible in their morning light, enormous and specific and indifferent, as they had always been. I put my tea down on the hallway floor because my hands needed to be free, though I could not have said for what. and I stood in the doorway of the wool room, with the morning coming in through the north window, and the seam, along the left side of the dress, that had not been there the afternoon before, and the valley around the homestead went silver to gold as the frost burned off the tussock, and I thought that whoever had taught my grandmother to sew had taught her extraordinarily well, because the stitching was as even and precise as anything I had seen in 44 years, and I had been looking at things carefully for most of them. Bev Tanner arrived at 9:30 in a mud-colored Land Cruiser that had clearly been doing actual work in actual mud for the entirety of its operational life, and she came up the front path with the particular stride of a woman who has been walking toward farmhouse doors for so long that the motion has become indistinguishable from her general posture. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older, with the kind of face that the central Otago climate produces in women who have spent decades in it. Not weathered in the pejorative sense, but clarified, reduced to its essential lines, the way the landscape itself is clarified by the absence of moisture and the presence of sustained cold. She wore a wool jersey the color of raw fleece, and carried a tin that turned out to contain shortbread, which she set on the kitchen table, without asking whether I wanted it, and filled the kettle without being invited. I had called her from the solicitor's card at 8 in the morning, because the dress had been sewn further in the night, and I needed to speak to someone who had known the homestead and known my grandmother in a way that I had not, and she was the only name I had. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at me with the direct, patient attention of someone who has been asked questions by strangers before and has learned to wait until the actual question surfaces beneath the preliminary ones. I told her about the dress. She did not react in the way I had been bracing for, not the polite skepticism of a person managing someone else's distress, not the overcorrection of someone who wants to be believed and therefore agrees too readily. She looked at the tin of shortbread and was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table, and then she said, "How much of the room have you been through?" I said I had not been through any of it. I had stood in the doorway twice and I had not gone in. She nodded. She said, "Maud would have wanted you to go in." I said, "Did you know she was still sewing?" Bev looked at me with an expression that contained a great deal of information organized in a way I could not yet fully read. She said, "I knew she came out here, after she moved to Ranfurly, before she got too frail for the drive. Tuesday afternoons, mostly. I drove her twice when her vision was bad enough that I did not want her on the valley road alone." I said, "The inventory. You completed the inventory 14 months ago." She said, "I did. There is no mention of the dress." She looked at the shortbread tin again, and I understood that the tin was performing a function for her, a place to put her eyes when she was deciding how much to say. She said, "The dress was not there 14 months ago." She said this with the precision of someone distinguishing between two statements that might sound similar but are not. Not that she had omitted it, but that it had not existed when she looked. The morning light through the kitchen window had reached the full, flat clarity of a central Otago autumn morning, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, that shows everything in the room with the equal, democratic attention of a light that makes no atmospheric concessions. In this light, Bev Tanner's face showed the specific expression of a person who has been holding a piece of information in custody for some time and is now assessing whether the person across the table is ready to receive it. I said, "Tell me about my grandmother." She said, "Which part?" I said, "Any part, I do not know." "Which is most of it?" Bev poured the tea she had made without asking and pushed my mug toward me and wrapped both hands around her own and said, in the measured voice of a person who has thought about how to begin this for longer than the current conversation, "Your grandmother was a sewer before she was anything else, before she was a station wife, before she was a mother. before she was the woman who ran Callaway Station for 40 years after your grandfather died. The sewing was the first thing, she said. She learned from her own mother, who was a professional seamstress in Dunedin before the war. Her mother's name was Iris. She died when Maud was very young, younger than she should have been to lose a mother, and the sewing was what she left. Not wealth, not property, the skill of it, the understanding of fabric and tension and what a seam requires in order to hold. I put my mug down. I said, "I did not know any of this," Bev said. "No." She said this without accusation. She said, "Your grandmother was not a woman who discussed herself. She was a woman who made things, and the making was how she communicated what she could not say in other ways. If you wanted to understand Maud Callaway, you needed to pay attention to what she made, and who she made it for, and why. I thought about the dress. I thought about the child's dress in deep gold merino, half made on the sewing table, in a room the inventory had not described it being in, sewn further in the night by something I had heard but not seen." I said, "Who was she making things for at the end?" Bev looked at me with the full direct attention she had been rationing since she arrived. She said, "You should look at the boxes." I said, "The boxes on the shelving." She said, "The ones at the back." The ones she labeled differently from the others. I said, "Differently how?" She said, "The others are labeled by content. Wool, merino, fabric weights, that sort of thing. The ones at the back are labeled by name." There was a silence that the kitchen held without difficulty. The silence of a room in a stone building in a valley where silence is the ambient condition, where the absence of sound is not emptiness but the baseline state of a place that has always had more stillness than noise and has made something of that proportion. I said, "Whose name?" Bev said, in the tone of someone delivering the precise word required and nothing around it. "Yours." I went into the wool room properly for the first time. Bev came as far as the doorway and stood there with her tea, not entering, which I understood without her explaining it as the behavior of someone who had a boundary with this room and had maintained it for reasons she considered sound. The shelving ran floor to ceiling along the left wall, and in the full morning light from the north window I could see what I had not been able to assess from the doorway in the previous afternoon's failing light, that the shelving was organized with the methodical precision of someone who had been adding to it over a long period of time and had thought carefully about its organization. The front sections were indeed labeled by content. The labels, written in my grandmother's hand in the black permanent marker that I would come to associate, over the following days, with everything she had catalogued and kept. Merino raw, merino washed, cotton summer weight, wool batting. The labels were consistent in their format, the writing level, and even on each box face. The back section of the shelving was in shadow, set behind the sewing table in the room's deepest corner, and when I moved around the table to reach it, I was close enough to the dress to see the new seam in detail. It was, as I had assessed from the doorway, extraordinary work, the stitches so even and so fine that the seam appeared almost seamless. The thread color matched to the fabric with a precision that suggested the thread had been chosen for exactly this fabric, rather than simply being close enough. I did not touch it. I was not ready to touch it. The boxes at the back were smaller than the others and stacked 3 deep on 2 shelves. They were labeled in the same black marker, but where the front boxes are named after a material, these are named a year. The years ran from 1998 to the previous year, 1 box per year, 25 boxes in total, arranged in chronological order from left to right and top to bottom with the same compulsive tidiness that organized the rest of the room. 1998 was the year I turned 17. I stood in front of the shelving and looked at 25 boxes and felt the specific physical sensation that arrives when a large truth presents itself before the mind has found language to receive it, a pressure in the sternum, a slight constriction of the throat. the body responding to scale before the intellect can. I lifted the first box. It was lighter than I expected. Not empty, but containing something that did not weigh much, something folded and soft. I brought it to the sewing table, to the clear space beside the dress, and I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed at its folds, was a garment. I lifted it out and held it up to the north window light. It was a blouse, merino, cream-colored, with a collar that had been sewn with the same fine precision as the seam on the dress. It was sized for a woman, and the sizing, the width of the shoulders, the length of the body, was close enough to my own measurements that the correspondence felt less like coincidence and more like documentation. Soon into the left side seam, in the way of handmade garments whose makers want them to carry their origin, was a small tag stitched in red thread. The tag read, "For Rowena, 1998. I set the blouse down on the table beside the half-made dress, and I opened the second box, another garment, a different year, the same tag. I opened a third and a fourth, moving faster now with the particular urgency of a person who has understood the outline of something and needs to confirm its dimensions. Each box contained a single garment. Each garment was sized for me, or for the version of me that would have existed in the year written on the box. The earlier ones, smaller in the shoulder, shorter in the body. The later ones adjusting as the years advanced, as if the maker had been watching my physical development from some vantage point I had not known existed and calibrating accordingly. Each tag was stitched in the same red thread. Each tag bore my name and the year. I sat down on the floor of the wool room among the open boxes, which is not a thing I do. I am not a person who sits on floors. It is an undignified position, and I have always valued my dignity in the precise, defended way of people who learned early that dignity was something you had to maintain actively because the people around you would not maintain it for you. I sat on the floor among the open boxes and held the 1998 blouse against my chest and looked at 25 years of garments made for me by a woman I had visited twice and understood. Not at all. And the wool room held me in its dry, lanolin-scented quiet, and outside the north window, the hawk duns stood in their morning light, enormous and patient, and the valley below them was gold and still. From the doorway, Bev said, in a voice that had lowered itself to match the quality of the room, "She made one every year. From the time you were born, she made one every year," I said, without turning around, because I was not ready for anyone to see my face. Why did she never send them? The pause that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. A pause with shape and weight. A pause that was performing the function of a sentence it had not yet decided to say out loud. Bev said, "That is the part I think you need to hear from the room itself." I did not know what this meant, and I did not ask, because the blouse in my hands was merino cream, and the stitching in the seam was perfect, and the tag said my name in red thread. And some things require silence around them before they can be approached with language. And the wool room was very good at silence, having been practicing it, apparently, for 25 years. The boxes held a chronology of me that I had not known anyone was keeping. I went through all 25 of them on the floor of the wool room, in the flat autumn light, with Bev Tanner still in the doorway, and her tea gone cold in her hand, and neither of us speaking, because the room had established a quality of attention that speech would have interrupted the way a footstep interrupts a held note. Each garment told me something about the year it had been made in, not through any label or notation, but through the fabric itself, the weight of it, the color, the particular character of the construction, the choices a maker makes when she is making something for someone she knows and is thinking about that person as she works. The 1998 blouse was cream merino, restrained, the collar sewn with a formality that suggested my grandmother had understood 17 as an age that wanted to be taken seriously and had made something accordingly. The 2003 pieces was a jacket, heavier wool, charcoal gray, cut with the kind of clean line that belongs to garments made for people in professional environments. I had started my first job in property development in 2003, a fact that my grandmother could not have known through any channel I was aware of, and yet the jacket was precisely what a person starting a professional life in a city would have needed, and it was sized for the body I had in that year, which was slightly broader in the shoulder than the 1998 blouse and slightly longer in the torso. The adjustments made with the accuracy of someone working from direct observation rather than memory. The 2011 piece was a coat, long dark green, double-breasted, lined with a fine merino in a darker green that was just visible at the cuffs and the hem. The lining a private thing, visible only to the wearer. The kind of detail that says, "I thought about your comfort in the cold, and then thought about your pleasure in the color, and then put the second thing inside the first, because some things are meant to be known only by the person they are made for." 2011 was the year my marriage ended. I held the coat for a longer time than I held the others. I held it with both hands at the shoulders, the way you hold a coat when you are deciding whether to put it on, and I thought about my grandmother in this room in that year, working on this coat, somehow knowing, that the year required something that would hold warmth and keep it private. I said to the coat rather than to Bev. How much did she know about my life? Bev, from the doorway, everything she could find. She said this simply, without apology for the word everything, as if everything was a reasonable amount for a grandmother to know about a grandchild she was not permitted to be close to. I said permitted. A silence. Then that is the word I would use, yes. I set the coat down on the table with the others, folded it the way it had been folded in its box. My grandmother had a specific folding method, I had noticed, that involved a central vertical crease and two side folds that resulted in a flat rectangle which minimized stress on the seams. And I looked at Bev in the doorway. I said, "Sit down and tell me what happened." She said, "There is nowhere to sit in there." "I have never been able to sit in there," I said. "Then stand and tell me." I said, "I am not leaving this room until I understand what I am looking at." Bev looked at her cold tea. She set it down on the hallway floor, outside the wool room, with the deliberateness of someone setting aside an object they have been using as a prop and no longer need. Then she straightened and looked at me, and her face had shifted from its assessing neutrality into something more direct. "The face of a person who has decided the time for waiting has passed," she said. "Your grandmother and your mother have not spoken in 31 years. I felt the floor of the wool room do something it had no physical reason to do, which was to become briefly uncertain beneath my feet. The solidity of the schist foundation and the timber boards above it, temporarily insufficient against the particular vertigo of a piece of information that reorders everything it touches. I said, "I know they are not close." Bev said, "That is not what I said. I said my mother told me they had a falling out when I was a child. She said my grandmother was difficult." Bev said, "Your mother told you a version of what happened that allowed her to be comfortable with what she had done. This is what people do with actions they cannot fully defend." She said it without heat, without the investment of someone who has chosen a side, in the tone of a person describing a weather pattern, accurate, impersonal, inevitable. I sat back down on the floor, not because my legs gave out, or not entirely because of that, because the floor felt like the right place to receive something that was going to be large. Bev said, "In 1993, your mother brought you to this homestead for the last time. You were 12 years old. There was an argument between your mother and Maud that I did not witness directly, but that I have heard described many times by Maud and by others who were present. The argument was about this room, about the sewing, about the time Maud spent in it, and the things she made in it, and the use she put it to." She paused. she said. Your mother believed that the things Maud made in this room were, she chose her word carefully, with the precision of someone quoting rather than interpreting, an embarrassment. She said this about the tradition of women making things with their hands, about the value of craft work, about the kind of woman the sewing represented, and the kind of woman your mother had decided to be instead, and the kind of woman she intended you to become. I thought about my mother, who had been a successful commercial lawyer for 35 years, and who kept her hands very still when she sat at tables, and who had told me, when I was perhaps 15, that the difference between women who were taken seriously and women who were not was largely a question of what they were seen to value. I said, she told my grandmother that. Bev said, she told your grandmother that what she made in this room was the work of a woman who had wasted herself. She said, she used those words precisely. Wasted herself, she said. And she told your grandmother that she would not be bringing you back to a place where that was what womanhood looked like, and that if Maud contacted you directly, she would ensure you knew that your grandmother was a person who had chosen smallness over substance, and that she had done it by choice. The wool room was very still. The north window held the hawk duns and the gold of the valley, and the particular thin clarity of the autumn midday light, and the dress on the sewing table, weighted with its new seam and its threaded needle, and the 25 boxes were open around me on the floor, with their tissue paper and their garments, and I sat among them and thought about being 12 years old and visiting this homestead for the last time without knowing it was the last time, and I could not remember the visit because 12 was too long ago, and I had been a child with a child's incomplete attention, and I had not known to pay the particular quality of attention you pay to things that are about to be taken from you. I said, my grandmother never tried to contact me. Bev said, she wrote to you every year on your birthday for the first 10 years, she said. The letters were returned unopened. I know this because she showed me the envelopes. She kept them. They are in the station office, in a box that is not on the inventory because she asked me not to include it, and I did not. A returned letter. 10 years of returned letters in a box in the station office, in a homestead at the end of a long metal track in a valley that preserved things the way the dry cold of central Otago preserved everything. Intact, unchanged, waiting, I said. And then she stopped writing and started making. Bev said, she told me once that she understood words could be returned. She said she did not think love could be returned in the same way. She said she believed that if she kept making the things, kept making them carefully and correctly, and in the right sizes for the person you were becoming, they would find their way to you eventually, that they would outlast whatever had been built to keep them from you. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. This is something I do not do. I am not, by habit or by history, a woman who presses her hand against her mouth to manage what she is feeling, because managing what I am feeling is something I do earlier in the process, before it arrives at the stage where it requires physical containment. I had not managed this one early enough, I said into the back of my hand. She made a garment every year for 25 years for a person she had never been allowed to give them to. Bev said, yes, I said. For 25 years she came to this room, and she made things for me that she could not send and could not give, and that sat in boxes on a shelf in a room in a valley that I had not visited since I was 12 years old. Bev said, yes. And then she said, with the gentleness of someone who knows the next thing is the hardest thing. The dress on the table is the 26th. I looked at the dress. It was further along than it had been when I sat down on the floor. I had not seen this immediately because I had been looking at the boxes, but now that I looked directly at the sewing table, the right side seam had been completed as well, and the hemline had been begun, a preliminary fold, basted rather than sewn, the kind of preparation that precedes the final pass with the needle, the work that happens just before the garment becomes finished. The room was warm enough that my breath was not visible. The north window was closed. The door behind Bev was the only opening. I said, "Bev, when did you last check on this room before I arrived?" She said, 3 weeks ago, the Tuesday before last. "I came to air the homestead before you came down." I said, "Was the dress there?" She said, "The table was bare when I left." I stood up from the floor among the open boxes, and I crossed to the sewing table, and I stood over the dress and looked at the hemline basting with the specific attention of a person who needs to be precise about what she is observing. The basting stitches were long and even, the preliminary work of a skilled hand. The thread used for the basting was a different color from the construction thread, white, temporary, meant to be removed once the final hem was sewn, a detail that told me whoever was doing this work understood not just how to sew, but why each stage of the process existed and what it was preparing for. My grandmother's hands in her last years at the residential home in Ranfurly had shaken with the tremor of very old age. I had noticed this at my one visit, the tea mug held in both hands to steady it, the fingers that did not fully extend. The hands that had made these 25 garments with their invisible seams and their red thread tags had been strong and precise hands, the hands of a woman in her working decades. And those hands had belonged to a woman who had been in a residential home for 2 years before dying in April and had not, by any rational account, been capable of traveling to this valley and working at this table in the night since I arrived. I said to the dress and to the room and to Bev behind me, "Who is finishing it?" The south wind, which had been absent since the previous evening, arrived against the north window in a single gust that pressed the glass briefly inward, and the woolroom's light shifted for a moment, and the lanolin smell deepened in the way that smells deepen when air pressure changes. And then the gust passed, and the light settled, and the room was as it had been. "Behind me," Bev said very quietly. "I think that is what she came back to do." I turned around. Bev was standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her face holding the expression of a woman who has known something for a long time and has been waiting, with the specific patience of someone accustomed to the pace of this valley, for the right person to arrive and be ready to hear it. She said, "The Kehua, in Maori understanding, are the spirits of those who have unfinished business with the living." She said, "I am Ngai Tahu on my mother's side, and I have lived in this valley for 60 years, and I have learned to pay attention to what this land knows about the dead and their unfinished work." She said, "Maud had one unfinished thing," she said. "She had a dress to complete." The dress on the table held its basted hemline in the north window light, and the 25 boxes stood open around my feet with their tissue paper and their red thread tags and their 25 years of unmailed love. And the valley outside was gold and enormous and absolutely still, and I understood, standing in the wool room of Callaway Station, that I had not come here to sell a property. I had come here to receive something that had been waiting for me since, before I was old enough to know, it was being made. I called my mother that afternoon from the front veranda, because the veranda was the place in the homestead where the phone signal was most reliable, and because I wanted to be outside when I made the call, in the open air of the valley with the ranges visible on both sides, and the tussock running its autumn gold in every direction, because I needed the scale of the landscape around me as a counterweight to what I was going to say. She answered on the third ring in the brisk, slightly compressed tone she uses for calls she has not scheduled, the tone that communicates she is between things, and this had better be worth the interruption. She said, "Rowena, are you in Alexandra?" I said, "I am at the homestead." A pause. Brief, but with a texture to it, the pause of a person who has been expecting a call and not expecting this one simultaneously. She said, "Good. Have you spoken to the agent yet?" "There is a firm in Cromwell that handles high country stations. I have the number somewhere," I said. "Mum." I need you to tell me about the argument. Silence. A different quality of silence from the pause. Longer with the specific weight of something being assessed rather than something being retrieved. She said, "What argument?" I said, "In 1993, the last time you brought me here." Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted register, not dramatically but detectably, the way a room's acoustics shift when a door is closed. The same voice, but with something removed from around it. She said, "Bev Tanner has been talking to you," I said. "Tell me what happened." She said, "What happened was that your grandmother was a woman who had spent her entire adult life in a valley the size of a postage stamp, making garments for people who could have bought them from a shop and calling it a life. And I was not going to allow that to become the model for yours." I said, "She was making them for me," my mother said. "She was keeping you in a world that had no future in it." She said this with the conviction of someone who has been repeating a belief long enough that the repetition has become indistinguishable from proof. She said, "I grew up watching that woman sit in that room for hours, days, weeks, when there was a station to run and decisions to make and a broader life available if she had chosen to reach for it. She chose the room instead. She chose the needle and the fabric, and she called it love, and it was not love, Rowena. It was retreat." I looked at the Hawkdun Range across the valley. The peaks were catching the afternoon light at an angle that made the schist faces glow a deep amber, the color of something very old being briefly illuminated, and the tussock below the ranges moved in the light south wind, in the slow, collective way of a thing that has been moving in this wind for longer than any individual life and will continue to do so. I said, "There are 25 garments in that room, made for me. One for every year since 1998. She made one every year, and she kept them in boxes. And she never sent them because you returned her letters unopened for 10 years, and she understood that the garments would also be returned if she tried to send them." My mother said nothing. I said, "She made a jacket for the year I started work. She made a coat for the year my marriage ended. She made a coat that fits me, that fits the body I have now, that she could only have known about if she was paying attention to me from a distance for 25 years, in the only way she was permitted to pay attention, which was through what she made for me in a room she knew I would eventually come to." My mother's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but not softer. Quieter in the way that a thing becomes quieter when it is applying more force rather than less, when the compression of the volume is itself a form of control. She said, "She made things for everyone, Rowena. That was how she communicated because that was the only language she had. It was not sophisticated, and it was not," I said. "Stop." I had not in 44 years said stop to my mother in that tone. The word landed in the call with the clarity of something dropped on stone, and the silence that followed it had a different shape from all the previous silences. Not the silence of assessment or retrieval or management, but the silence of a person who has not been spoken to in that way before, and does not yet know what it means for the conversation's structure. I said, "I am not going to argue about the value of what she did. I am going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, not strategically, not in the version that is comfortable." She said nothing, which I took as the closest available form of assent. I said, "Did you know that she was still making things for me all these years? Did you know, and did you not tell me?" The pause that followed was the longest pause of the call, long enough that I looked at the phone to verify the connection was still active. My mother said, "I knew she continued to sew." I said, "That is not what I asked." A shorter pause. Then, in a voice that had lost most of its compression and become something older and less managed, "I did not know about the boxes. I did not know she had kept all of it. I thought." She stopped. I thought she had eventually accepted that the distance was for the best and had moved on to other things. I said, She made a garment every year for 25 years for a person she was never permitted to give them to. She made them in the right fabric and the right size, and she tagged each one with my name and the year, and she stored them in boxes on a shelf, and she waited for me to come and find them, because she understood that I would come eventually, and when I came, I would need to understand what the years had contained. My mother said very quietly, "Rowena," I said, "I am not going to sell the homestead." Another silence. I said, "I do not know yet what I am going to do with it, but I am not going to sell it. And I am going to stay here for as long as it takes me to go through everything in this house and understand who she was and what she spent her life doing and why she spent it doing it. And when I have done that, I will call you again, and we will have a different conversation from this one." I ended the call before she could respond, which is something I have never done to my mother, and stood on the veranda with the phone in my hand, and the valley spread out below the homestead in its autumn afternoon light, and I breathed the dry, cold, mineral air of the place, and I felt something in my chest that I did not have immediate language for. Not righteous, not victorious, not the clean satisfaction of a difficult thing done well, but something rawer and less organized than any of those. Something that had the quality of a thing that has been sealed for a long time and is only now discovering what happens when the seal is broken. Bev had gone home before I made the call, with the tact of a woman who understood that certain conversations require privacy and certain revelations require time to settle before the next thing can begin. She had left the shortbread tin on the kitchen table and had written her phone number on the back of an envelope she found in the station office, and before she left she had stood in the hallway outside the wool room and looked in at the dress on the table and said, in the tone of a person stating a practical fact, "It will be finished tonight." I had said, "How do you know?" She had said, "Because it has been started, and she was always a woman who finished what she started, and she has been waiting a long time to finish this one." I went back into the wool room in the late afternoon, when the north window light had turned the amber gold of 4 o'clock in the Ida Valley in April, and I sat in the chair beside the sewing table. There was a chair, a plain wooden chair, with a cushion on it that had been recovered at some point in a fabric that matched nothing else in the room, and was therefore probably something my grandmother had made from a remnant, using it because it was there and wasting nothing. And I looked at the dress and the boxes, and I let the room be what it was around me. It smelled of lanolin and dry timber and the faint sweetness of old tissue paper, and beneath these things, very faintly, the way a perfume is present in a room where someone has recently been, there was something warmer. Not a scent exactly, but a quality of the air. The quality that a room holds when it has recently been occupied by a person who is engaged in focused work. The warmth of concentration. The specific atmospheric residue of a mind attending to something it cared about. I picked up the 1998 blouse and held it in both hands in the amber light. The seams were invisible. I turned the blouse inside out and examined the stitching from the back. Because if you want to understand the quality of a piece of sewing, you look at the work the maker did not expect to be seen. The work on the inside, the finishing, that will be pressed against skin rather than presented to the world. The seam allowances were even and neat, finished with a hand stitch that rolled the raw edge under and secured it against fraying. Unnecessary work. Work that a maker does not need to do for a garment to be structurally sound. Work that is done purely out of the conviction that the inside of a thing deserves the same care as the outside. I thought about my mother's hands, which she kept very still at tables. I thought about my grandmother's hands, which had shaken with tremor in the residential home in Ranfurly, and which had, before the tremor came, produced 25 garments of invisible seams and red thread tags and inside work as careful as outside work. For 25 years. for a person those hands had not touched since she was 12 years old. I thought about what my mother had said. It was not love, Rowena, it was retreat. I turned the blouse right side out and held it up against me in the amber light, the way you hold a garment when you are considering putting it on, and the shoulders aligned with my shoulders, and the body length was correct, and the collar sat at the precise height that a collar should sit, and I understood with the completeness of a thing understood in the body, for the mind has organized it into propositions that my mother was wrong. Not in the way I had wanted to believe my mother was wrong, which was in the clean and satisfying way of a person being definitively incorrect about a fact, in the more complicated way of a person who had looked at something true and named it incorrectly because the correct name would have required her to also name something about herself, about the kind of distance she had constructed, and the reason she had constructed it, and what it had cost the people on the other side of it. The amber light deepened toward the blue shadow of early evening in the basin. I turned the chair so it faced the north window and the last of the valley light, and I sat with the blouse in my lap, and I let myself be in the room without doing anything with being in it, which is something I have not done in a very long time, possibly not since childhood, possibly not ever with any completeness. At some point in the early evening, in the blue light interval between the last of the day and the first of the dark, I became aware that the quality of the room had changed, not audibly, not through any signal the ordinary senses would have logged and reported, but the warmth that I had noticed in the air, the warmth of concentration, of a mind attending to something, had deepened or become more specific, or moved from the ambient air of the whole room into the area immediately around the sewing table, the way a heat source concentrates when you are close to it rather than across the room from it. I did not look at the table. I sat with the blouse in my lap and the valley going dark in the north window, and I breathed slowly, with the deliberateness of a person who has decided that the correct response to something is to be still and present, and to not perform any reaction, because the performance of reaction is a way of controlling an experience rather than receiving it. And I had spent 44 years controlling experiences, and I was finished doing it. I said aloud to the room and to whatever the room contained. I found them, I said. I found all 25 of them. The quality of the air around the table changed again. In a way I cannot make more precise than this. It became attentive. It had the quality of attention from a direction I could not locate, the quality of being heard without being able to identify who is listening. I said, the coat from 2011. I said, I needed that coat very much that year, and I did not know it existed, and I was very cold without it. I said this plainly. Without the scaffolding of qualifications I usually build around statements that expose me, because the room was not a room that required scaffolding, and because my grandmother, whatever remained of her in this dry and lanolin-scented air, was not a person who had ever required me to protect myself from her. The needle on the sewing table caught the last trace of window light and held it briefly, a single point of brightness in the dimming room, and then the light was gone, and the valley was dark, and the room was dark around me, except for the faint silver of the starlit tussock visible through the north window, numerous and structural above the old man range. I sat in the dark with the blouse in my lap, and the dress on the table beside me, and the 25 years of unmailed love arranged in their open boxes around my feet. And I was not afraid, which is a thing worth noting precisely, because I am a person who has been afraid of a great many things for a great many years, most of them with considerably less cause than this. What I felt in the dark of the wool room in the Ida Valley with the stars over the ranges and my grandmother's work in my hands was the specific and unfamiliar feeling of a person who has been kept from something for a long time, and has finally, in a room at the end of a hallway in a valley she did not know she belonged to. Been given it back. I woke before dawn on the third morning to the sound of the treadle, not the periodic, grouped repetition of the first night. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, but a sustained rhythm, continuous and purposeful, the sound of a machine being worked at pace by someone who knew it well enough that the pace was comfortable rather than effortful, a rhythm that had the quality of long habit, the rhythm of hands and feet that had been doing this work for so many decades that the machine and the persons operating it had arrived at a mutual understanding, each anticipating the other, the foot on the treadle and the fabric moving through the needle in a single coordinated motion that required no conscious management. I lay in the narrow bed under the merino blanket and listened. The sound came from below with a clarity that the stone walls of the homestead should not, architecturally speaking, have permitted. Stone absorbs sound rather than transmitting it. This is one of the practical advantages of schist construction in a working station environment, where the noise of animals and machinery and weather needs to be manageable inside the house. And yet the rhythm of the treadle arrived in the second bedroom with the specificity of something happening in the adjacent room rather than on the floor below. I could hear, beneath the primary rhythm of the foot pedal, the secondary sound of the fabric moving, a soft, directional sound, the sound of something being guided through a mechanism by hands that knew exactly where it needed to go. I dressed in the dark because the dark in the Ida Valley at 4 in the morning in April is complete enough that a lamp makes a genuine difference, and I had not brought one up with me the previous evening, and I did not want to go back for it. I dressed by touch in the same clothes I had worn the day before, and I went down the stairs holding the banister with both hands, placing my feet on the outer edges of the treads the way you do in old houses where the middle of each tread has its own particular creak accumulated over decades of use. The hallway was dark. The strip of light under the wool room door was thin and yellowish, the light of the single pull-cord bulb rather than natural light, which meant my mind arriving at this observation and then stopping with it for a moment before proceeding, that the bulb was on and I had not turned it on before I went to bed, and Bev Tanner had gone home before dark. I stood at the wool room door. The treadle sound was clear and unhurried on the other side of it, not mechanical in the way of an unattended machine running on momentum. That sound would have been irregular, slowing as it lost energy, the rhythm degrading without input. This was attended. This was a machine being worked by someone paying attention to it, guiding it, making decisions about pace and pressure and direction as the work required. I put my hand on the door latch. The latch was cold in the way that metal in a stone building is cold in the early hours of an autumn morning, the specific cold of something that has been at the temperature of the stone around it for the entire night. I pressed it down. I pushed the door inward. The light from the pull-cord bulb fell across the room in the flat, honest way of a single overhead source, illuminating the shelving and the floor and the sewing table and the dress on the table. And the dress was finished. The room was empty of any visible presence. But the treadle at the base of the table, the cast-iron foot pedal that I had registered on my first proper entry into the room as belonging to the table's original design, a design that included the mechanism for a treadle machine even though no treadle machine was present, was moving. The foot pedal oscillated in its slow, steady arc, back and forward, decelerating now as I watched, the arc diminishing gradually the way a pendulum diminishes when the force that set it moving has been withdrawn, until after perhaps 8 full oscillations, it came to rest. I crossed the room to the sewing table. The dress was complete. Every seam, every hem, the collar, the cuffs, the buttons, small buttons of what appeared to be bone or shell, creamy white against the deep gold of the merino, all of it finished with the invisible precision that characterized every garment in every box on the shelving. I reached out and lifted the dress from the table by its shoulders, the way my grandmother had held her garments in the amber light of 100 previous afternoons, and I turned it in the overhead light and examined the seams in the hemline and the inside finishing. The inside was as careful as the outside. The seam allowances rolled and hand-stitched. The hem turned twice and sewn with a stitch so fine that from the right side the fabric appeared to end in a clean, self-generated line rather than a folded and secured edge. The collar was interfaced with something that gave it body without stiffness, the kind of structural decision that a maker makes when she understands not just the technique but the reason for the technique. Sewn into the left side seam in red thread was a tag. I held it close to the light. It read, "For Rowena, this year," not the specific year, this year. As if the year did not need naming because we were both in it, she and I, in the wool room at 4 in the morning with the treadle stilled and the dress complete, and the 25 boxes open on the floor around the chair where I had sat in the blue evening light the previous night and told her about the coat. I pressed the dress against my chest with both arms. The way you hold something you have been given by someone who is no longer physically present and whom you cannot thank in any of the ordinary ways, and the dry, warm smell of new merino rose from the fabric. Not old lanolin, not the preserved smell of the stored garments, but the fresh smell of wool that has just been worked, just been passed through a machine, just been shaped by hands into the form it was always going to take. I stood in the wool room holding the dress until the cold of 4 in the morning became something I could not manage with just the clothing I had put on in the dark upstairs. And then I went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table until the valley outside the window began its slow pre-dawn brightening. The stars over the hawk duns fading first at the eastern horizon in the particular reluctant way of stars in a sky, with no atmospheric moisture to diffuse the light's departure. At 6:30 I called Bev. She answered as if she had been awake, which she had. She told me later she had not slept well, that she had felt, in the farmhouse 3 kilometers down the valley road, where she had lived for 40 years, a specific quality of wakefulness that she associated with significant events at the station, a quality she had felt twice before in her life, both times on nights when something at Callaway had completed itself. I told her the dress was finished. She said, "I know." I said, "There was no one in the room." She said, "There was no one you could see." "No." I said, "The treadle moved. I watched it decelerate." I said, "There is no machine attached to the treadle mount. The table has the mechanism for a treadle machine, but the machine itself is not there." Bev said the singer was Maud's mother's. The original singer, the one Iris used in Dunedin before the war. Maud brought it to the valley when she married your grandfather. She said, "It was in that room for 40 years until your mother took it." I set my tea down. I said, "My mother took it," Bev said, "in 93. After the argument. She came back 2 weeks later with a van and a man from Alexandra, and she took the singer and several other things she said were rightfully hers as the next of kin. She said this with the flat accuracy of a person reciting a documented fact, not the heat of someone still angry about it, because 60 years in the Ida Valley produces a relationship with the past that is more geological than emotional. The past as strata, visible and fixed, neither mourned nor celebrated but simply present. I said, "She took the machine that belonged to my grandmother's mother. She took it in 93 and she..." I stopped. I started again. I said, "Does she still have it?" Bev said, "As far as I know," she said. "Your mother was not a woman who gave things back once she had decided they were hers." I thought about the singer, the specific machine on which Iris had learned to sew in Dunedin, which Maud had brought to the valley, which had sat in this room for 4 decades producing the invisible seams and precise hemlines that I was now cataloging in 25 garments spread across the floor, which my mother had taken in 1993 along with whatever else she had judged to be rightfully hers. The taking of it a kind of final punctuation on the argument, a way of removing from the room the one thing that made the room what it was, and yet the room had continued to be what it was. The dress on the table had been sewn by something, on a machine that was not physically present, using the treadle mount that remained in the table as the only material evidence that the machine had once been there. The quality of the work was indistinguishable from the quality of the work in the 25 boxes, which had been made on the singer before it was taken, which meant that what was working in this room at 4 in the morning was not dependent on the physical presence of the instrument. It was dependent on the knowledge, on the hands that had learned on that machine, and the years those hands had put into the learning, and the love that had organized the learning into a sustained, private, decades-long act of making things for a person who did not know they were being made for her. Bev said, into the silence on the phone. "What are you going to do?" I said. "I am going to go through the station office. I am going to find the box with the letters. And then I am going to call my mother again," Bev said. "And the property?" I said. "The property is not going anywhere," she said. "No." She said it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has known all along that this was how it would go, who had been waiting with the patience of the valley for the person it was waiting for to arrive and understand what she had arrived into. The station office held the particular order of a mind that had been managing a working property for 4 decades and had developed, in that management, the specific organizational logic of someone who knew that the difference between a station that functioned and one that did not was largely a question of whether you could find what you needed when you needed it. The filing system was mods, built over decades of careful addition, and it covered not only the station's operational records, stock management, land records, accounts, correspondence with the Alexandra solicitor going back to the 1960s, but also the personal records that a woman living alone in a remote valley accumulates when she has no one with whom to share the weight of them. The box that Bev had not included in the inventory was on the bottom shelf, behind the operational files, in a plain brown cardboard box the size of a shoebox, labeled in the same black permanent marker in my grandmother's handwriting. The label said Rowena. Letters returned. Inside were 43 envelopes, all of them addressed to me at my parents' address in Auckland, in my grandmother's small, level handwriting, with the precise stamp placement of someone who believed that care in small things was the foundation of care in larger ones. All of them are marked in red pen on the front face, not stamped by the postal service, marked by hand with a single word, return. My mother's handwriting, the R with its particular backward lean, the capital letter she had always formed with the pressure of someone who wrote with intention rather than habit. Return, 43 times, for 10 years. I sat on the floor of the station office with 43 returned letters in a box in my lap, and I thought about a woman sitting at the sewing table in the wool room, opening the post that had come back again, reading the word on each envelope in the handwriting of her own daughter, and then putting the envelope in the box with the others and going back to the table and making, just making, because the making could not be returned. I opened the earliest letter. The paper inside was thin, the kind of thin paper that comes in pads bought for letter writing, the kind that is now almost impossible to find because almost no one writes letters anymore, because words can be returned and words can be blocked and words can be deleted at the source before they ever arrive. But a garment in deep gold merino in the right size for the body of the person you are thinking about cannot be intercepted in the same way, cannot be marked and sent back, cannot be undone once it is made. My grandmother's handwriting inside the letter was the same as on the box label, small and level and precise. The date at the top was the 14th of March, 1986, my 5th birthday. The letter said, "Dear Rowena, you are 5 today, and I am thinking of you in the valley where the tussock is going gold for autumn. I have made you something. I will send it with this letter, and I hope it reaches you before the cold sets in. Though you are in Auckland and the cold, there is not what we call cold down here, where the frost comes hard in May and the basin goes white and silent in a way that I have always found beautiful rather than harsh. I hope you are well and growing. I hope you are happy. I hope someone is teaching you to pay attention to the world with your hands as well as your eyes. Your grandmother, Maud." The letter was alone in its envelope. Whatever she had made to send with it had not been included. The postal system does not accommodate garments, and she would have known this, which meant she had attempted to send both and had separated them before posting. The garment returned to the room where it waited, the letter sent alone into the world, and returned unopened with a word in red. I sat on the floor of the station office for a long time. Outside the homestead, the Ida Valley went about its April morning in the unhurried way of a place that has never needed to hurry about anything. The tussock moving in the light north wind, the schist-tors on the Old Man Range standing in their formations against the high blue sky, the air between the ranges dry and cold and full of the particular clarity that is this valley's primary and permanent characteristic, a clarity that shows everything exactly as it is, without softening, without the atmospheric blur of moisture or the haze of human density, just the thing itself, sharp-edged and specific and honest in the way that only very old and very dry places are honest. The dress in the wool room was waiting on the table. It was made for this year, and it was my size, and the inside seams were as careful as the outside seams, and the tag in the left side seam said my name in red thread. I was going to put it on. I was going to put on every one of the 26 garments, in the order they had been made. And I was going to stand in the north window of the wool room in each one and let the valley see me wearing what my grandmother had spent 26 years making for me, because she had never been able to give them and I had never been able to receive them, and the valley had preserved both of us in our respective absences, and this was the only ceremony available to us now, and it was enough, and it was right, and it was exactly what the room had been waiting, with the patience of all dry and quiet places, for me to be ready to do. I started with the 1986 piece, which was not in the 25 boxes I had opened on the floor, because 1986 predated the year my grandmother had begun labeling by name. The earliest box on the shelving was 1998, the year I turned 17, and I had assumed this was where the series began. But the letter from my 5th birthday had mentioned something made to accompany it, and when I went back to the shelving with that knowledge and looked more carefully, I found, on the very bottom shelf behind the operational files I had been moving to reach the letter box, a second set of boxes smaller than the others, pushed to the back wall of the shelving with the particular deliberateness of things stored out of easy reach. These boxes were not labeled with years. They were labeled with ages, age 5, age 6, age 7, running forward to age 16. 12 boxes in total, one for each year from my 5th birthday to the year before my grandmother began labeling by calendar year instead. I brought them out one by one and set them on the station office floor and opened them in order. The age 5 piece was a pinafore, deep red wool, simply cut, with pockets sewn at the front in a contrasting fabric. A cream cotton with a small printed pattern that I had to hold close to the window to resolve. And when I resolved it, the pattern was tussock heads, tiny stylized seed heads repeated across the cream ground, a fabric my grandmother had either found or made specifically because it carried the valley in miniature. The pinafore was sized for a 5-year-old, and it was so small in my adult hands that holding it had the quality of holding something from another order of scale, the way a child's shoe held by an adult hand seems to belong to a different category of object, rather than simply a smaller version of the same one. The age 6 piece was a dress in blue cotton, the kind of blue that belongs to a Canterbury sky in summer. Not the deep saturated blue of the central Otago winter sky, but the lighter, more provisional blue of a warm, clear day, a blue that contains the possibility of clouds. The age 7 piece was a skirt in green merino. The age 8 piece was a blouse in white cotton with embroidery at the collar. Small flowers worked in a stem stitch around the neckline, each flower with 5 petals and a yellow center the size of a pinhead. I sat on the floor with the embroidered blouse in my hands and looked at the flowers. The stem stitch was so fine that each petal required perhaps 4 stitches to complete, and there were perhaps 40 flowers around the collar, each one identical in size and spacing, worked in the particular way of a person doing embroidery that does not announce itself, that sits quietly in its place and rewards close attention rather than demanding it from a distance. I counted 4 petals on the nearest flower before I understood that counting was a way of not feeling what I was feeling, which was the specific, delayed grief of something beautiful received too late to thank the person who made it. I had been a child who would have worn this blouse. I had been a child who would have run her fingers around the embroidered collar and thought the flowers were the best thing she had ever been given, and worn them until it was too small, and then kept it anyway because the flowers made it impossible to give up. I had been that child somewhere in Auckland in the years when these blouses and pinafores and skirts were being made for me in a wool room in the Ida Valley, and I had worn other clothes instead, clothes bought from shops, clothes without embroidered collars or tussock print pockets, or the specific warmth of something made by hands that were thinking of you while they worked. The age 11 piece was a coat, shorter than the 2011 coat, obviously, made for a child's proportions, with a double row of buttons and a hood that was lined in a fleece the color of the valley's winter tussock, the pale gold silver of grass gone dormant. I put my hand inside the hood, and the fleece was still soft, preserved by the dryness, and it was warm against my palm in the way of materials that retain the memory of their function even after decades of disuse. And I sat with my hand inside the hood of a coat made for the 11-year-old I had been, in the station office of a homestead I had been brought to twice in my entire life, and I let myself be ruined by it, which is the only word that is accurate. Not devastated, not overcome, but ruined in the precise sense of a structure that has had its organizing principle removed, and must now be rebuilt according to different plans. I sat with the coat in my lap for a long time. Then I stood up and I carried all 26 pieces, 12 from the age-labeled boxes, and the 25 from the year-labeled boxes, minus the one I had in mind for last, through the hallway and into the wool room, and I laid them across the shelving and the table and the chair in the order they had been made. The age 5 pinafore at the far left of the shelving, the finished dress at the far right on the table. 26 garments in a line that represented 38 years of making in the specific way my grandmother had chosen to make, which was privately and consistently and without any expectation of acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement was not the point. The making was the point. The maintenance of the intention was the point. I began with the pinafore. I could not obviously put on a pinafore made for a 5-year-old. This was not a ceremony of wearing in the literal sense. The garments ranged from a size made for a young child to the current size of my adult body, and most of them could not be worn by the person I was now. But I had understood, sitting in the station office with the embroidered blouse, what the ceremony required, and it did not require the clothes to fit. What it required was attention, the same quality of attention that had given them. I held the pinafore up to the north window in the morning light, the same north window, the same hawk-dun light, and I looked at it completely, the way you look at something when you have decided that looking is itself a form of receiving. when the looking is not preliminary to some other action but is the action. I looked at the tussock print pockets, and the precise seam that ran from the shoulder to the pocket top on each side, and the hemline that had been turned twice and hand-stitched with the invisible stitch I was coming to recognize as my grandmother's specific signature, the thing she did to every hem of every garment because she believed the inside deserved the care the outside received. I said, I would have loved this. I said it aloud to the room and to the north window, and to whatever in the air of the wool room had been present at 4 a.m. when the treadle had completed its work. I said, I was a child who would have loved the pockets especially. I said, I am sorry I never got to love it when I was small enough for it. I set the pinafore down on the chair and picked up the age 6 blue dress. I went through them one by one, in order, and with each one I said something. Not a formal thing, not a thing I had prepared, but whatever the garment produced in me when I held it in the north window light and gave it my full attention. The blue dress produced a memory of a summer I had spent in Auckland when I was 6, in a garden that had a lemon tree, and how the lemons had smelled in the heat, and how the sky on those summer days had been exactly this blue, and how I had not thought about that summer in perhaps 30 years. The green merino skirt produced a thought about the color green and how I had never worn it as an adult, had always defaulted to gray and black and navy, the colors of professional environments and professional distance, and how the green of the skirt was the green of the pasture in the station's front paddock in spring, a green that had warmth in it rather than coolness, that belonged to a living thing rather than a manufactured palette. The embroidered blouse was the hardest. I held it for a longer time than the others, and I did not say anything for a while, and the room held the silence with the patience it had always had, and eventually I said, she counted all the petals. I said, there are 40 flowers and each one has the same number of petals and the same size center, and I do not know how long that took, but I know it was longer than it needed to be for the blouse to be beautiful, and she did it anyway. And this is what I mean when I say I did not understand her. I went through the year-labeled garments more quickly in some ways and more slowly in others. The jacket from 2003 I held for a long time. The coat from 2011 I put on, because it was my size, and I stood in the north window in it with the valley spread out below, and I looked at the Hawk Dun Range in the morning light, and I wore the coat that should have been mine in the year my marriage ended, and was not, and the merino was warm, and the green was the right green, and the lining was darker green at the cuffs and the hem. By the time I reached the dress on the table, the morning was fully established, the flat midday light of a central Otago autumn settling over the valley with its democratic illumination, showing everything without preference, the tussock and the schist and the distant water of the reservoir and the Old Man Range in its ancient, uninvested permanence. I picked up the dress. It was the right size. I had understood this when I first saw it, and I understood it more completely now, having held 25 other garments calibrated to the person I had been at each previous year of my life, and feeling in each one the accuracy of my grandmother's attention. This dress was made for the person I was now, not the professional self, not the city self, but the self that had arrived in this valley and sat on floors in wool rooms and called her mother and said, "Stop," and opened 43 returned letters and held an embroidered blouse against her face. I went upstairs and I took off what I was wearing and I put on the dress. The merino settled against my skin with a specific warmth of natural fiber worn next to the body, the warmth that has temperature and texture both, that feels like being held rather than merely covered. The shoulders sat where shoulders should sit. The waist was right. The hem fell at the length that suited the proportions of the garment, which was also the length that suited mine, because my grandmother had been attending to me for 38 years and knew my proportions the way a maker knows the work she has been doing longest. I came back downstairs and stood in the north window of the wool room. The valley was enormous outside the glass. The ranges on both sides, the tussock floor between them, the high blue sky above the schist peaks, the specific dry clarity of air that had no moisture in it to soften or blur what it revealed. I stood in the north window in the dress my dead grandmother had finished in the night, and I let the valley see me in it. The room behind me was quiet with the particular quiet of a completed thing, not empty, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a task finished. The specific stillness that a workspace holds when the work it was organized around has reached its conclusion, when the machine is stilled and the fabric is shaped, and the needle has made its last pass through the material and withdrawn. I said to the valley and to the room and to the 38 years of careful, private, unreceived love that had accumulated in this space and was now finally received, I am going to stay. The north window held the ranges and the sky, and the dry air of the valley came through the gap at the window's edge, where the seal had shrunk with decades of the valley's particular dryness, and it smelled of tussock and schist and the specific mineral clarity of a place that preserves things, and underneath those things, very faint and very warm, the smell of new merino that had just been worked by hands I would never hold and shaped into a garment I would wear for the rest of my life. Something in the quality of the room shifted in a way that had no physical correlate I could identify. Not a sound, not a movement, not any change in the light or the air or the temperature of the stone walls, but a change nonetheless, the change of a space that has been organized around an absence and has now been organized around a presence instead, the change of a room that has, after 38 years, been given the person it was always making things for. The solicitor's name was Graham Firth, and he drove out from Alexandra on the Thursday in a dark blue sedan that was inappropriate for the valley road and arrived with mud on the wheel arches that suggested he had learned this about the road the hard way. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with the careful manner of someone who has spent a career managing other people's difficult moments and has developed, in that management, a professional warmth that is genuine rather than performed. The warmth of a person who actually finds human situations interesting, rather than one who has learned to approximate interest as a service skill. I had called him on the Wednesday and told him I was not selling. He had received this with the equanimity of a man who has heard many decisions about property and has long since stopped having opinions about them, and he had said he would come out to discuss the implications, which were primarily administrative. The estate needed to be formally settled, the property transferred from the estate to my name, various documentation completed and filed with the relevant offices in Alexandra and Dunedin. He had said this would take some weeks to process fully, but that the practical effect was immediate. I could stay, and the homestead was mine. We sat on the front veranda in the thin April warmth of the midday sun, which provided light without significant heat at this latitude in this season, but was pleasant enough in the absence of wind, with tea I had made from the kitchen and a plate of shortbread from Bev's tin that still had several pieces remaining. Graham Firth ate shortbread with the attentiveness of a man who appreciates good baking and does not pretend otherwise, and he looked at the valley in the way of someone seeing it properly for the first time, rather than simply passing through it. He said, "Your grandmother was here for 60 years. I said, 61. She came here when she married my grandfather in 1962. He said, I have known her for the last 20 of those. She was a remarkable client. He said this with the specific respect of a professional, for a person who had understood what they needed and communicated it clearly without requiring hand-holding or repetition. He said, she knew exactly what she wanted for the property, and she had known it for years before she formalized it. The bequest to you was not a late decision. It was in the will from the first version she brought to me in 2008. 2008, 14 years before her death. She had decided in 2008 that this property would come to me, and she had maintained that decision through every subsequent version of the will, through the years when I had not visited and had not called, and had not, by any external measure, done anything to justify the faith the decision represented. I said, "Did she tell you why she chose me?" Graham Firth looked at the short plate. He said, "She told me that the property needed to go to the person who would understand what it was for," she said. "She told me this was not the same as the person who deserved it in any conventional sense, and that it was not a judgment on anyone else in the family. She said it was simply a matter of fit. She used that word, fit, in the way a seamstress would use it, I thought, though she did not elaborate on that. I looked at the valley. The south wind had arrived mid-morning, light and consistent, moving the tussock in the slow collective way I was coming to read as the valley's rest. Not stillness, but this. The minimal animation of a landscape that is always slightly in motion, always slightly alive in the way of things that have been in the same relationship with the same wind for long enough that the motion is structural rather than incidental. I said, "There is something I need to ask you about the estate, something that is not straightforward," he said. "Most of the interesting things are not," I said. "My mother took a sewing machine from this property in 1993, after an argument with my grandmother. The machine had belonged to my grandmother's mother, Iris, who was a professional seamstress in Dunedin. It came to my grandmother as an inheritance and had been in the wool room of this homestead for approximately 30 years before my mother removed it. Graham Firth put down his shortbread and gave me his full professional attention, which was a different quality of attention from the conversational attention he had been deploying on the veranda. Focused, precise, the attention of someone activating a specific mode of thought. I said, "It was not my mother's to take. It was part of the homestead's contents, and therefore, I would argue, part of the property that has now come to me. I want it back," he said. "Do you know where it is currently?" I said, "My mother's house in Auckland, as far as I am aware." He said, "Has it been in her possession continuously since '93? I said, "As far as I know, yes." He said, "This is a civil matter rather than a criminal one, and it is complicated by the time elapsed, which creates questions about adverse possession and the practical enforceability of a claim," he said. "However, the machine was taken without the consent of the property owner, who was alive at the time and who did not subsequently gift or formally transfer the machine to your mother." He paused. He said, "Did your grandmother ever raise the matter legally?" I said. "She was not, I think, a person who resolved things through legal means if she could resolve them through other means." He said, "No, she was not." He said this with the fond recognition of a man who had spent 20 years working for someone whose methods he admired even when they complicated his professional life. He said, "I will write to your mother's solicitor a formal letter requesting the return of the item as part of the estate's assets. It will not be aggressive. It will simply be accurate, and accuracy in these matters is usually sufficient." I said, "She will not respond well to it," he said. "People rarely respond well to accurate letters about things they have taken." He said this with the mild observational tone of a man who has sent a great many such letters and has made his peace with the range of responses they produce. He said, "However, responding well is not the same as responding correctly, and in my experience, most people, when presented with an accurate account of what they have done, find a way to do the correct thing eventually." "It may take some time," I said. "I have time." He looked at me with the slight adjustment of expression that occurs when someone has heard something they did not expect and is recalibrating. He said, "You are planning to stay." I said, "I am planning to live here." I said, "I need to understand the station's operational situation, the land, what it requires, what it can support." I said, "I know nothing about running a high-country station, and I am aware this is a significant gap, and I intend to address it," he said. "There is a manager, a man named Alistair Cope, who has been running the stock operation under a lease arrangement since your grandmother moved to Furley. He is competent, and he knows this land well," he said. He had assumed the arrangement would conclude with the property's sale, but if you are keeping it, a continuation of the lease is an option worth discussing. I wrote the name down in the notepad I had found in the station office and had been using for the accumulating list of things I needed to understand about this place. The notepad had been my grandmother's. Half its pages were used, filled with the small, level handwriting I was coming to know. Notes about stock and pasture and weather and the particular operational conversions of a station in a basin where the frost comes hard in May and the summer is short and fierce, and the water supply depends on the snowmelt from the ranges. I had started writing on the blank pages from the back, so that her notes and mine ran toward each other from opposite ends of the same book. After Graham Firth left, I walked to the station for the first time. Not the immediate surrounds of the homestead which I had covered in the course of the previous day's orientation, but the land itself, the front paddocks sloping down toward the valley road, the back country rising toward the Old Man Range, the track that ran along the western fence line toward the wool shed, and the yards and the water race that brought the snowmelt down from the upper catchment. I walked for 3 hours in the afternoon light, in the dress my grandmother had made for me, which was not practical walking attire, and which I wore anyway because I had decided, standing in the north window of the wool room, that practicality could wait. The land was drier than I had understood from the homestead. Up close, the tussock was a complex ecology rather than a simple ground cover, not a uniform mat, but a collection of individual plants, each one a tightly packed bundle of narrow leaves, each bundle separated from the next by bare ground and schist fragments, and, in the lower-lying areas, the gray-green of various small plants I did not have names for, but which the land clearly considered important enough to maintain. The schist was everywhere underfoot, breaking through the soil surface in irregular formations, the gray and orange of weathered feldspar and mica catching the afternoon light in flashes that made the paddock surface appear to be full of something briefly luminous just below the visible layer. The air away from the homestead was even drier than in the building. I could feel it in my throat and on the skin of my hands, not the desiccating dryness of an unpleasant environment, but the clean, mineral dryness of a place that simply does not retain moisture because the geology beneath it does not permit retention, the dryness of schist country that has been draining itself since before the ranges that surround it were fully formed. I walked the western fence line to the wool shed, which was a large corrugated iron structure of the same vintage as the homestead's roof, amber-brown with age and use. Inside, the smell was the concentrated version of the smell that underpinned the entire station. Not the indoor lanolin of the wool room, but the outdoor lanolin of working fleece and working animals. Decades of shearing seasons accumulated in the timber and the iron. A smell that was warm and animal and entirely specific to this function, to this building, to this operation, repeated year after year in this valley since the 1890s. I stood in the wool shed in the afternoon light that came through the gaps in the iron cladding in long, particulate shafts, and I thought about my grandmother standing in this same space for 60 years of shearing seasons, managing the operation after my grandfather died, learning what she needed to learn to keep the station running because the alternative was to leave the valley, and she was not, by any evidence I had gathered in the preceding days, a woman who left things. I walked back to the homestead in the last of the afternoon light, and the dress moved around my legs in the south wind, and the valley was its 4 o'clock gold around me, and I thought that the fit was right, which was what my grandmother had told the solicitor, and the solicitor had told me, using the word the way a seamstress would use it. He had thought, though he had not elaborated on that. I elaborated on it now, alone in the valley with the schist underfoot and the ranges on both sides, and the homestead ahead, the amber roof catching the low sun. Fit is not about deserving. Fit is not about having earned something through demonstrable effort or consistent presence. Fit is about the relationship between a shape and the space it is made to occupy, the specific correspondence between the cut of a garment and the body it was cut for, the specific correspondence between a person and a piece of land that has been waiting, in its dry and patient way, for the right occupant. My grandmother had understood this. She had understood it about garments, and she had understood it about land, and she had understood it about me, from a distance of 1,000 kilometers for 38 years, and she had put that understanding into boxes on a shelf in a wool room, and waited for me to come and find it. I reached the homestead as the first stars appeared above the eastern range, the high blue-white stars of the central Otago autumn sky, numerous and structural against the deepening dark. The wool room light was on. I had not turned it on before I left. I went down the hallway and stood in the doorway and looked in. The room was as I had left it. The open boxes, the garments laid across the shelving, the sewing table with its treadle mount and its clear surface, the dress now absent because it was on my body. The light was on, and the room was empty and warm, with the warmth of concentration, and the lanolin smell was strong in the way it was strong when the room had recently been in use. On the sewing table, where the dress had waited, was a length of fabric, new fabric, uncut, not yet shaped into anything, folded neatly in the precise central crease method that I had come to know as my grandmother's specific folding. It was a wool tweed in the colors of the valley, tussock gold and schist gray, and a thread of the blue-green that the reservoir took on in the afternoon light, woven in a pattern that was not a pattern exactly, but a texture, the texture of this landscape rendered in fiber specific to this place and no other. Beside the fabric, laid with the same care as the fabric, was a piece of paper. I crossed the room and picked it up. The handwriting was my grandmother's, small, level, precise. The paper was thin, the thin paper of the letter pad, the same paper as the 43 returned envelopes in the station office. It said, "There is enough here for a coat. The pattern is on the shelf behind you, in the brown envelope with your name on it. I could not finish everything I wanted to make for you, but I can leave you what you need to finish it yourself." It said, "The machine will come back. Have patience with the process." It said, "You fit this place, Rowena. I knew it before you did." That is what grandmothers are for. I stood in the wool room with the note in my hand and the tweed on the table, and the valley outside the north window going full dark, star-dense, and enormous and cold, and I understood that the ceremony of receiving was not finished, that it had simply moved into a new stage, not the stage of being given things, but the stage of learning to make them, of taking up the work at the point where the maker had set it down, of carrying forward what had been left for me to carry. In a room at the end of a hallway, in a valley that preserved everything it was given and would preserve this too, the work and the hands that did it, and the love that organized both. The brown envelope had been on the shelf behind me the entire time. I had not seen it in my initial survey of the shelving because it was tucked between two of the larger fabric storage boxes in the front section, its spine flush with the box faces, visible only if you were looking for something at that specific height, with that specific thinness. It was a standard brown envelope of the kind used for documents rather than correspondence, the kind with a metal clasp rather than a gummed seal, the kind that is meant to be opened and closed multiple times rather than sealed once and sent. My name was written on the front in the black permanent marker. in the same hand as the box labels, the same level, unhurried writing. I opened it at the sewing table, standing, because the note on the table had said the pattern was behind me, and I had turned and found it, and the finding had produced in me a quality of alertness that was not compatible with sitting, the alertness of someone following a trail that is still being laid rather than one that has been laid and is simply awaiting discovery. Inside the envelope were several sheets of tracing paper and 2 sheets of heavier drafting paper, the kind used for technical drawings folded into quarters. I unfolded the drafting paper first. They were pattern pieces, hand-drafted in the meticulous way of patterns made before commercial pattern companies existed or were affordable in remote places, each piece drawn with a precision that was architectural in its accuracy. The curves of armholes and collar stands rendered with a steady, practiced hand, the grain lines marked with double-headed arrows, the seam allowances indicated with a dotted line running parallel to each edge at a consistent distance, the pieces labeled in the small handwriting. Back, cut 1 on fold. Front, cut 2 sleeve. Collar stand, cut 1 on fold. Collar, cut 2. On the top sheet, in the upper right corner, my grandmother had written, "This is the coat pattern I have been using for your size since 2007. The measurements are current. The fitting notes are on the tracing paper." The tracing paper sheets contained fitting notes in a shorthand I had to decode gradually. Standing at the table in the wool room's overhead light, the abbreviations of a maker who had been working from the same set of measurements for a long time, and had developed a private notation for the adjustments the body required. SBA with an arrow and a number. I worked out after some minutes that this meant shoulder blade adjustment, the additional room a pattern needs at the back to accommodate the way a specific person's shoulders sit. The numbers were precise to the quarter-inch, noted with the specificity of someone who understood that a quarter-inch in a coat made the difference between a coat that fit and a coat that was worn out of resignation rather than pleasure. She had been adjusting these patterns for my body for 17 years without ever measuring me directly. I thought about what this required. Not just skill, though the skill was evident and considerable, but attention of a particular sustained and disciplined kind. The attention of someone who had been gathering information about me from whatever sources were available for 17 years and translating that information into the quarter-inch increments of pattern adjustment. Photographs, perhaps. The photographs that circulate in families, even when the families are fractured. The photographs from weddings and christenings and the social occasions that someone always documents and that find their way through the capillary action of family connection to the people who are not quite in the frame but who are still quietly looking. My cousin Diane had a social media presence and posted family photographs with the frequency of someone who considered this a form of community maintenance. My grandmother had not obviously used social media, but Bev Tanner had mentioned on her second visit to the homestead that she had been in the habit of passing things along to Maud. Articles from the newspaper, the occasional photograph, anything that arrived at Bev's farmhouse through the ordinary channels of a valley community that kept track of its own. A quarter-inch at the shoulder blade. 17 years of adjustment. The coat on the table in 2011 had fit me perfectly. I sat down with the pattern pieces spread across the sewing table, and the tracing paper fitting notes arranged in the order they had been made, and I read through them as if they were a document, which they were, a document in the specific language of garment making, a language I did not speak but could begin to learn, the vocabulary of which was visible in every piece of work, in every box on the shelving. This was, I understood, the thing the note had been directing me toward. Not simply the coat, though the coat was the immediate and practical application. The note had said I could not finish everything I wanted to make for you, but I can leave you what you need to finish it yourself. The pattern was not only a pattern for a coat, it was an instruction in how to look at making, how to see a piece of fabric as containing a garment the way a piece of land contains a station, latent, requiring the right set of hands and the right quality of attention to bring it into its correct form. I did not know how to sew. This was the practical reality I had been circling since the morning I stood in the north window in the completed dress. My grandmother had left me the materials and the pattern and the workspace and 38 years of completed examples of the kind of work the workspace was intended to produce, and I did not know how to operate a sewing machine, how to cut fabric on the grain, how to transfer pattern markings, how to ease a sleeve into an armhole, or how to set a collar stand, or how to achieve the invisible hemstitch that distinguished the inside of every garment in every box. Bev arrived at 9 the following morning in the mud-colored Land Cruiser, which I had come to regard as a reliable marker of the day's beginning, and she came into the wool room and looked at the pattern pieces spread across the table, and the tweed folded at the end, and the note, which I had left where I found it, and she stood in the room in a way she had not stood in it before, fully, with both feet on the floor inside the doorway rather than planted on the threshold. And she looked at everything with the expression of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had known was coming. She said, "She left you the coat pattern." I said, "She left me with the coat pattern and a note that says I should learn to make it myself." I said, "I do not know how to sew." I said this plainly, without the embarrassment I might once have brought to admitting a gap in competence, because the wool room had cured me of several defensive habits, and this was one of them. Bev said, "I know." She said it without any particular weight on the knowledge, as a simple fact rather than a judgment. Then she said, "I can teach you the basics, enough to begin." She said, "I am not the maker Maud was. Nobody in this valley was the maker Maud was, but I learned enough from watching her over 40 years to get you started, and the rest you will learn from doing it, which is how she learned and how her mother learned before her." I said, "You will need a machine." "There is no machine in this room." Bev looked at the treadle mount, she said. "There is the mount," I said. "The singer is in Auckland," she said, "for now." She said it with the same quiet certainty she had deployed on every other significant statement she had made in this wool room, the certainty of a woman who lived in a valley that preserved things and had watched the valley do its preserving for 60 years and had arrived at a faith in the process that was not mystical, but observational. Not "I believe this will happen," but "I have watched this happen, and I have watched it happen enough times to recognize when it is happening again." I said, "Graham Firth wrote to her solicitor." Bev said yes. She said, "Give it time. The valley is patient." We spent the morning together in the wool room, not sewing. There was no machine to sew on, but going through the completed garment systematically, Bev demonstrating on each one the techniques my grandmother had used, turning the pieces inside out, and pointing with one blunt finger to the specific stitches, naming them and describing the motion that produced them, the angle of the needle and the tension of the thread and the particular way the fabric is held against the natural resistance of its weave. She spoke about these things with the measured precision of someone passing on knowledge they consider important and do not want to transmit carelessly, and I listened with the specific quality of attention I had been developing since arriving in the valley. The attention that receives rather than assesses, that allows a thing to arrive in its own form rather than immediately translating it into categories the receiving mind already holds. I wrote things in the notebook that had been my grandmother's and had her operational thoughts in the first half, and my accumulating questions and observations in the second half, the two sets of writing moving toward each other from opposite ends of the same book, not yet meeting in the middle. In the afternoon, Bev went home and I sat at the sewing table with the pattern pieces and the fitting notes and the folded tweed, and I did not attempt to do anything with them because I did not yet know enough to do anything responsibly, but I sat with them in the same way I had sat with the garments in the previous days, attending to them, letting them be present, learning the quality of their presence before I attempted to work with them. My phone rang at 4 o'clock. The number was my mother's Auckland landline. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. She said, "I received a letter from a solicitor in Alexandra." I said, "Yes," she said, after a pause that had the quality of something being reorganized rather than something being retrieved. "The machine belonged to Maud." I said, "It belonged to Maud's mother before it belonged to Maud." "It has been in that family for at least 80 years, I said. "It belongs in this room," my mother said. "I took it because I was angry." She said this in the tone of someone making a precise and uncomfortable admission rather than an apology, the tone of someone who distinguishes carefully between acknowledging a fact and expressing regret about it, because the acknowledgement is available and the regret is still being worked toward. She said, "I took it because I wanted to remove the thing that was the center of what I was arguing against. And it was a foolish and unkind thing to do, and I have known this for a long time." I sat very still at the sewing table. I said, "Has it been used?" She said, "No." She said, "I do not sew." "I never learned," she said. "It has been in the storage room since '93. I had it serviced once, perhaps 10 years ago, because I felt I should maintain it even though I was not using it and had no intention of using it, and the man who serviced it said it was in excellent mechanical condition." I said, "I would like it back." She said, "That is why I am calling, rather than having my solicitor respond to yours." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There are also some other things from that visit, things I took that I have been less comfortable about over the years than I was at the time." I said, "Bring them when you bring the machine." A pause. "You are staying there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Rowena." She said my name in the way she says it when she is not managing the conversation, when the management has been temporarily suspended by something larger than management can contain. She said, "I did not know about all of it, the boxes, the years of it." I knew she continued to sew. I did not know the scale of what she was keeping she stopped. She said, "I did not know she had kept all of it." I said, "I know you did not know." I said this without gentleness, but also without cruelty, in the tone of someone stating a fact that is simultaneously true and insufficient, a fact that establishes a limit but does not establish an absolution. I said, "Come when you are ready." "Not before," she said. "I will come in a fortnight." I said, "I will be here." I ended the call and sat in the wool room with the afternoon light coming through the north window in the flat, clear, characterless way of central Otago light, when the sun has passed its peak, and the shadows have gone long, and the valley floor has taken on the deeper gold of late afternoon. The tweed on the table was exactly that gold, the deep specific gold of the tussock in this light at this hour. The color my grandmother had chosen for the dress she was making when she died and had returned to finish. The color she had chosen for the coat material she left me to make myself. The valley outside the window was still and enormous and patient. I put my hand flat on the tweed fabric. It was soft in the way of quality wool before it has been worked, the fibers not yet compressed by the tension of the seam or the heat of the iron, still fully themselves, still holding the air between them that gives wool its warmth. The weave was tight and even, the colors integrated rather than blended, each thread its own color, the tussock gold and the schist gray and the blue-green of the reservoir, running through the cloth individually and creating their combined effect by proximity rather than mixture, the way a landscape creates its color, not through blending, but through the specific placing of distinct elements in relation to each other. I thought about the coat the pattern would make. I thought about learning to make it, about the months the learning would take, and the errors the learning would require, and the patience the errors would demand. And I thought that patience was not something I had ever cultivated deliberately, but was something the valley appeared to be cultivating in me whether I had deliberated on it or not. The way the valley's dryness preserved things, whether the things had intended to be preserved or not. Outside, the south wind arrived in its late afternoon way, light and steady, moving the tussock in the slow collective motion of the valley's resting state. The wool room was warm, with the warmth of the afternoon sun on the stone walls, which held heat the way schist holds heat, slowly acquired and slowly released. The thermal mass of something that has been absorbing the same sun for a very long time, and has learned to make the most of what it is given. I was going to learn to make a coat. It was going to take a long time. It was going to be imperfect in the ways that first things are imperfect. The imperfection of hands that are learning a motion they have not yet internalized. The imperfection that is not failure, but evidence of the learning process being genuine rather than performed. The seams would not be invisible. The hemline would not be turned with the confidence of a hand that knows exactly how many stitches the turning requires. The collar stand would give me difficulty, I was certain of this, because Bev had pointed to the collar stands on each of the completed coats and described them as the test of a maker's understanding of the relationship between structure and surface, the place where the coat either committed to its own form or revealed that the maker had not yet fully understood what the form required. I was going to make it anyway, with whatever understanding I could bring to it at the beginning. And the understanding would grow with the making, and the next coat would be better, and the one after that better still, in the incremental way that skill develops when it is practiced with genuine attention and genuine willingness to be corrected by the work itself. My grandmother had begun somewhere. She had begun with hands that did not yet know what they were capable of and a machine that had belonged to her mother and the particular combination of inheritance and intention that produces, over time, the invisible seams and the red thread tags and the 38 years of careful, private, unreceived love that had been waiting in this room for me to come and find it and take it forward into whatever came next. My mother arrived on a Friday, 2 weeks after the phone call, in a hire car from Queenstown Airport that was also inappropriate for the Valley Road, because my mother has always made her arrangements based on where she is going, rather than on the route required to get there, which is a habit of mind I now understand differently than I once did, not as carelessness, but as the specific limitation of a person who has spent a long time looking forward and has not developed the lateral attention that routes require. She arrived in the early afternoon, when the valley was at its most direct, the midday light having given way to the first of the afternoon's angular light, the tussock beginning its daily progression from flat gold to deep gold as the sun moved toward the western range. I watched the hire car come down the valley road from the front veranda, where I had been sitting with the notebook and a mug of tea, working through the operational notes in my grandmother's handwriting that I was slowly learning to read as a primer on this land, what it needed in each season, where it was generous and where it required careful management, the specific knowledge of a person who had been paying attention to a particular piece of ground for 60 years, and had recorded that attention in the compact, unsentimental notation of someone who wrote for utility rather than posterity. The hire car turned onto the metal track and came slowly up it, more slowly than Graham Firth's sedan had come, which told me my mother was attending to the track rather than simply proceeding on the assumption that it would manage itself, which was not a small thing. She got out of the car in a coat I had not seen before, dark navy wool, well cut, the coat of a person who buys quality and maintains it. and she stood beside the car and looked at the homestead and the veranda and me on it, and she did not move immediately, which was also not a small thing. My mother is a woman who moves with purpose and efficiency and does not generally pause between arriving somewhere and proceeding to the next action. The pause was information. I came down the veranda steps. We stood facing each other in the thin afternoon warmth of the valley, with the ranges on both sides and the tussock moving in the light south wind and the homestead behind me in its amber-roofed solidity. And my mother looked at me the way she had not looked at me in a very long time. Not assessing, not managing, but simply looking. The way you look at a person when you are trying to see them rather than calibrate them. She said, "You are wearing one of hers." I was wearing the 2003 jacket, the charcoal gray professional piece that my grandmother had made for the year I started work. I had been wearing various pieces from the boxes on a rotation through the preceding 2 weeks, partly as a practical matter, and partly as a continuation of the ceremony of receiving that I had begun on the morning of the north window. Moving through the years of the work, wearing each piece in the valley where it had been made, giving each one the use it had been made for, however belatedly. I said, "Yes," she said, "it fits you well." I said she knew my measurements. She said, very quietly, with the particular quietness of someone making an effort at precision in a situation where imprecision would be more comfortable. I know she did. We went inside and I made tea, and my mother sat at the kitchen table in the navy coat without taking it off, which I understood as the behavior of a person who is not yet fully committed to being in the room, who is keeping the option of departure available even as she has arrived. I set the tea in front of her and sat across the table and waited, because the valley had been teaching me to wait, and I was becoming, if not naturally patient, then at least capable of something that resembled patience in its external characteristics. She said, "I brought the machine." I said, "I saw it in the boot when you got out." She said, "It is heavy. We will need to carry it in together." This practical statement occupied the space where neither of us knew yet how to begin the larger conversation, and I was grateful for it, and I thought my mother was probably grateful for it too. The object in the boot of the hire car, as a task to be accomplished before the other things had to be faced, which is how difficult human situations often proceed. The physical action as a bridge between the arrival and the reckoning. We brought the singer in together. It was, as she had said, heavy, cast iron and steel, the weight of a machine built for decades of industrial use, built to be stationary and permanent, and to outlast the hands that operated it. It came in a case that had been made for it, a fitted wooden case with a handle and latches, old wood darkened with handling, the kind of case that has traveled with its contents through multiple lifetimes, and carries in its surfaces the evidence of each one. My mother had wrapped the case in moving blankets in the boot of the hire car and secured it with straps, and the care of the packing was noted by some part of me that was paying attention to everything she did, and would continue to pay attention for the duration of her visit. We set it on the woolroom floor, in the center, and I opened the case. The machine was exactly what the treadle mount had been waiting for. I understood this immediately and without needing to measure. The dimensions of the machine and the dimensions of the mount were made for each other, made as a set, separated for 31 years and now returned to the same room. The machine was black and gold in the manner of the industrial Singer, the gold lettering of the brand name, still legible on the arm, the nickel of the needle and the presser foot still bright. The cabinet wood of the base worn smooth at the edges where decades of hands had rested. My mother stood in the wool room and looked at the shelving and the boxes, some of which were still open from my cataloging of the previous weeks. She looked at the sewing table and the pattern pieces spread across it, the fitting notes in their tracing paper, the folded tweed at the end. She looked at the garments I had arranged back on the shelving, in chronological order after the ceremony of wearing, each piece folded in my grandmother's method and placed in sequence. The H5 pinafore at the far left, the completed dress at the far right. She moved to the shelving and looked at the pinafore. She did not touch it immediately. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides and looked at the tussock print pockets and the precise shoulder seams and the hemline. And her face did the thing I had watched Graham Firth's face do, and Bev's face do, and my own face do in the bathroom mirror on the morning after I first went through all the boxes. The slow reorganization of an expression under the pressure of something that changes the way you see what you are looking at, she said. I wore one of these when I was young. She said it very quietly. She said, the pockets were different on mine, she said. I had forgotten she made them. She put one finger on the edge of the pinafore, the lightest possible contact, the contact of someone who is testing whether touching a thing will break something they cannot afford to have broken, she said. I was horrible to her. I said, yes, she said. I know that is not adequate. I said, it is accurate. Accurate is a better starting place than adequate. She turned from the shelving and looked at me with the expression she had worn in the hire car's pause before getting out. The expression of someone trying to see, rather than calibrate. She said, the letters. Bev told me about the letters, I said. I found them. 43 of them in a box in the station office that was not on the inventory. My mother sat down in a chair beside the sewing table, the plain wooden chair with the remnant cushion, the chair my grandmother had sat in for 60 years of working in this room, and she sat in it with the posture of a person who has sat down not as a decision, but as a necessity, the body requiring the support that the chair offered before the next thing could be said. She said, I did not read them. I wrote return on them, and I put them back in the post, and I did not read them. I said, I know. She said, I did not want to read them because if I read them, I would have had to think about what I was doing rather than simply continuing to do it, and continuing to do it was easier. She said, this is not a defense. It is an explanation and not a particularly impressive one. I said, no. I said, it is honest, which is different. The afternoon light through the north window had deepened to the 4 o'clock gold, the specific color of the valley at this hour that I was coming to know as reliably as I knew the color of the city sky above the buildings outside my Auckland office window, which I was no longer in and did not intend to return to. The tweed on the sewing table was exactly that gold, and the window behind it framed the hawk duns in their enormous, patient permanence, and the room smelled of lanolin and dry timber, and the specific warmth of the singer which had been in the boot of the hire car, and had taken on the warmth of the afternoon sun during the drive. I lifted the singer and set it on the treadle mount. It settled into place with the particular solidity of a thing returning to the position it was designed for. Not a sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that occurs when two things that belong together are in contact, the stillness of a fit achieved rather than approximated. I latched the machine to the mount at the 2 points where the latches were designed to engage, and they engaged cleanly, without force, as if they had been kept clean and functional specifically against this moment. My mother watched me do this from the chair. She said, "Do you know how to use it?" I said, "Bev is teaching me." I said, "I am going to make the coat." I showed her the pattern pieces on the table, the fitting notes on the tracing paper, and she leaned forward and looked at them with the attention she brings to documents. Close, reading rather than glancing, the professional habit of a woman who has spent her career in the careful parsing of what is written, she said. "The measurements are yours," I said. She adjusted the pattern for me every year since 2007, without measuring me directly. My mother looked at the fitting notes for a long moment. She said very carefully, "She was paying attention to you," she said. All that time she was paying attention to you in the only way she was permitted to. I said, yes, she said. I permitted very little, I said. You permitted nothing. And then I said, because the accuracy required completion. And she found a way around nothing. She made things and she kept them and she waited for me to come and find them. And I found them, and I am here. My mother's hands, which she has kept very still at tables for as long as I can remember, moved to the arms of the plain wooden chair and rested there. Not still, but present. Not performing composure, but simply existing in the room without the management that composure requires. She looked at the singer on the treadle mount, and the pattern on the table, and the garments on the shelving, and the tweed folded at the end of the table, waiting for the hands that would learn to make something of it. She said, I would like to see the letters. I said, they are in the station office, she said. Would you sit with me while I read them? I looked at my mother in the chair my grandmother had sat in the room my grandmother had worked in the valley my grandmother had chosen and stayed in for 60 years, and I thought about the note on the sewing table, and what it had said, and what it had not needed to say, and I thought about fit, the fit between a garment and a body, the fit between a body and a place, the fit between a person and the work they are made for. I said, yes. We sat in the station office as the valley went to its early dark, the 2 lamps on the desk making a warm, limited circle of light in the stone-walled room, and my mother read 43 letters in the order they had been written, from the thin paper birthday letter of 1986 to the last one, dated 2004, after which my grandmother had understood that the letters would keep being returned, and had put the understanding away, and gone back to the room and the table and the making. My mother read without speaking. I sat across the desk and did not speak either, and the valley held its autumn dark around the homestead, and the singer was on the treadle mount in the wool room where it had always belonged. And outside the station office window, the stars over the Old Man Range were appearing in their accumulating numbers, the high, cold, numerous stars of central Otago. More than you can believe are there until you are in a place with no moisture and no light pollution, and you look up and understand that the sky has always contained this many, and you simply could not see them from where you were standing before. When she finished the last letter, my mother sat for a while without speaking. Then she said, she wrote very well, I said. Yes, she said, she wrote the way she sewed. The same, she paused, choosing the word, the same even. Care nothing wasted. I said, yes. She said, I have a great deal to account for. I said, you do. And then I said, you have time. The valley is patient. She looked up from the letters at this, at the phrase, and I saw her register it as something learned rather than native to me, something I had acquired here, in this place, in these 2 weeks. And I watched her understand that the acquisition was real, rather than performed, that I had arrived somewhere and had been changed by the arriving. Outside, the south wind moved through the tussock with the sound it always made at night, lower than the daytime sound, less dispersed, more concentrated by the cold air that had settled into the basin, a sound like something breathing steadily in the dark. We went back to the wool room before bed. My mother stood in the doorway, the threshold, as Bev had stood at the threshold, and looked at the singer on the mount and the pattern on the table and the folded tweed, and she said, will you show me how it works, when you have learned? I said, yes. She said, I never learned because she offered to teach me, and I refused because refusing was part of what I was doing then. She said this with the flat accuracy that was the closest she was coming to contrition, the accuracy of someone who has decided that precision is more respectful than softness in this particular accounting. She said, I have thought about that refusal more times than I have thought about most things in my professional life. I said, then you will learn with me. Bev will teach us both. My mother looked at the tussock gold tweed on the table, and at the pattern pieces, and at the singer, waiting on its mount, with the needle bright in the overhead light and the tension dial at the setting my grandmother had left it at, the setting she had calibrated over decades, for this specific machine and this specific thread and this specific quality of work. She said, "A coat," I said, "a coat. For this valley, for the cold that comes in May when the frost settles into the basin and stays," she said. "It will take a long time to learn to make it well." I said, "We have time." The wool room was warm with the warmth of the stone walls releasing the day's accumulated heat, and the lanolin smell was deep and present, and the singer sat on its mount with the solidity of a machine that has been in the right place and knows it, and the tweed was exactly the color of the valley in the afternoon light that I had been learning to read as a language, the language of a place that preserves what it is given and gives back what has been kept in trust. In the morning, Bev would come in the mud-colored Land Cruiser and we would begin. We would thread the machine and set the tension and cut the first pieces of the tweed on the long table in the wool room, the cutting done on the grain my grandmother had marked on the pattern pieces, and the first stitches would be imperfect, and the first seam would require unpicking, and the unpicking would be part of the learning, and the learning would take as long as it needed to take, and not one moment less. And the coat, when it was finished, weeks from now, months from now, whenever the hands had learned what the work required, would hang in the hallway of the homestead at the end of the long metal track in the Ida Valley, beside the other coats on the row of hooks my grandmother had put there for exactly this purpose, for the cold that came in off the ranges without apology and required something well made to meet it. My name was already on the hook. She had put a small label there in the black permanent marker, at some point in the years of making and keeping and waiting. Just the name. Just Rowena, in the small, level handwriting that I had been learning to read as its own kind of language all my life without knowing it. The language that said, "I am here, and I am paying attention, and I am making something for you, and it will be ready when you are." I stood at the hallway hooks and put my hand over the label and felt the letters beneath my fingertips, raised slightly where the marker had pooled at the corners of each character, specific and permanent in mine. The valley breathed in the dark outside the homestead walls. The singer waited on its mount. The tussock moved in the cold south wind with the patience of something that has been doing this for longer than any of us, and will continue to do it after we are gone. After the names on the hooks and the tags and the seams and the letters in the station office have been received and held and eventually passed on to whoever comes next, which is how love works when it is the lasting kind, not diminishing with the passing but accumulating, each generation of hands adding to what the previous hands made, the work growing larger and more specific and more honestly itself with every careful stitch. I went to bed in my grandmother's homestead in the valley she had chosen and stayed in and left me, and the stars above the Old Man Range were numerous and structural and cold, and in the wool room the singer sat on its mount in the dark, and the pattern was on the table, and the tweed was folded and waiting, and the coat that I was going to learn to make was already, in some way that the valley understood, and I was beginning to understand, already made, already existing in the intention of the hands that had shaped the pattern and chosen the fabric and set the tension dial and left the label on the hook, the hands that had known, before I did, that I was coming, and had prepared everything I would need.